네, 여러분 반갑습니다. 이른
Pleased
아침부터
to meet
중앙일보
you.
CSIS 포럼
Welcome to the
2021과 함께해 주신 여러분
JoongAng
진심으로
Forum
환영합니다.
2021.
저는 오늘 사회를 맡은 JTBC
I
아나운서
am
강지영입니다.
강지영, and
Hello
I
and
will
thank
be
you for joining us for 중앙일보 CSIS Forum 2021. I'm JTBC presenter 강지영. 네, 오늘 생중계는 한국어, 영어 동시 통역으로 진행이 되는데요. 우선 한국어 청취를 원하시는 분들께서는 중앙일보와 JTBC 뉴스 유튜브 채널에서 참여해주시면 되겠습니다. 영어로는 JTBC 뉴스 유튜브 채널과 CSIS 웹사이트에서 함께하실 수 있습니다. You may be watching one of the channels that we are live streaming, but just to make sure you are set on the channel with the language of your choice. We have simultaneous interpretation in Korean on YouTube channels for JoongAng Ilbo and JTBC News. For simultaneous interpretation in English, please go to JTBC YouTube channel and CSIS website. 네, 올해 초 미국 바이든 정부의 출범에 이어서
Early this year, we had the launch of the Biden administration, and next year we have the presidential elections in Korea. We will take a look at the diplomatic policies of the next government, which is more important than ever before. Today's forum is under the title of the Biden era and Korea's global strategy. We will be taking a look at the policies of the two main presidential candidates as well as the U.S. policies. During session 1, we will look at Korea's survival equation in the era of U.S.-China confrontation, and session 2, the road to Korean Peninsula denuclearization and peace, and then we will go to Professor Park Myung-lim's presentation. Due to the COVID-19 situation, we are virtually connecting the JTBC studio in Ilsan with the United States. We look forward to your attention until the very end. Let us now invite the opening remarks. We have with us in the studio Chairman Hong Seok-hyun of the JoongAng Holdings, as well as the Chairman of the Korea Peace Foundation. Chairman Hong, we would like to invite you for your opening remarks.
여러분 안녕하십니까?
Hello, everyone. The
코로나19의
latest
새로운
COVID-19
변이인
variant,
오미크론이 전 세계를 위협하고
Omicron, is
있습니다.
threatening the world.
그러나 우리는
Despite this
한반도와
threat,
동아시아
we have
그리고
gathered for
세계의
this virtual
정상화 평화를
conversation, hoping
염원하면서
for normalization
이렇게
and peace of the
화상으로
Korean Peninsula
대화를 나누고
in
있습니다.
East Asia and the world.
오랜 친구인
My
존
longtime
헨리
friends at
CSIS
CSIS,
소장,
the Center for Strategic and
차
International
한국
Studies,
석좌,
President John Henry,
마이클
Korea
그린,
Chair Victor
일본
Cha,
석좌,
and Japan
모두
Chair Michael
반갑습니다.
Green. So good to see you all, albeit virtually.
한국의 송민순,
Former foreign
윤병세 전
ministers
외교부
Song Min-soon
장관과
and Yoon
싱가포르
Byung-se,
전
former
주일
ambassador
대사,
to Japan Shin
고유환
Gak-soo, President Go
통일연구원
Yu-hwan of the Korea
박명림
Institute for
연세대
National
교수,
Unification,
그리고
Professor
이재명
Park Myung-lim of
윤석열
Yonsei
대통령
University,
후보
and
캠프의
foreign policy advisors for the
외교안보팀
presidential
부과장인
campaigns of Lee Jae-myung
유성락
and
전
Yoon Suk-yeol,
한반도
Ambassador Wi
평화교섭본부장,
Sung-lak, former
김성한
special
전
representative
외교부
for
차관을
Korean
포함한
Peninsula Peace and Security
양국의
Affairs,
모든
and
참가자들께
Professor Kim Sung-an,
따뜻한
former Vice Minister of Foreign
감사의
Affairs. My
인사를
warm
드립니다.
greetings and thanks to all of you for
여러분, 저는
participating
1년 전
in
바로
the
이
discussions
자리에서
today.
21세기
Ladies and
인류
gentlemen, at this
문명을
very
위협하는
forum a year
팬데믹은
ago, I said
국제
that
연대와
the
협력을
COVID-19
통해
pandemic,
가장
which is dealing a
취약한
blow to
아프리카
21st
대륙에서
century
끝나야
human civilization,
비로소
can only be
마침표를
defeated
찍을 것이라고
when the most
했습니다.
vulnerable African continent overcomes the
아프리카에서
pandemic
시작된
through
오미크론의
international
확산을
solidarity and
지켜보면서
cooperation.
모두가
As we
안전하지
witness the
않으면
spread of the
누구도
new
안전할 수 없다는
Omicron variant
사실을
first
깨닫고
identified in Africa, we're realizing
요즘에는
that no one is safe
백신
unless everyone
민족주의는
is safe.
선진국의 자살
These
행위라는
days, I agree with UCLA professor Jared
교수의 비판을
Diamond's view that the
공감하고
vaccine nationalism of developed countries
이
is
지점에서
suicidal.
저는
At this
이른바
point,
기존
I
질서의
bring into
주도 세력인
question
미국과
whether
새로운
the United
세력으로
States, the
부상하는
dominant
중국이
power in the existing
글로벌
order,
공공재를
and China,
충분히
the rising
공급하고
superpower,
있는지를
are providing
묻고
public
싶습니다.
goods in sufficient supply for the
20세기
world.
초 영국을
Historically,
제치고
the
신흥세력으로
United States,
떠오른
which had
미국은
replaced Britain
당시
as the new leading
국제사회가
power
필요로
at the
하는
dawn of the 20th
충분한
century,
공공재를
failed to
제공하지
deliver
못해
sufficient public goods to the
1930년대
international community,
대공황이
and
발생했습니다.
that led to the Great Depression in the
그 결과
1930s.
극심한
As a
경제난에
result,
처한
Germany
독일에서
was hit
히틀러의
hard by
나치
severe
정권이
economic turmoil,
탄생했고
which gave
2차
rise to Hitler's
세계대전으로
Nazi regime,
이어졌습니다.
which in
이를
turn led to
비판한
the Second World War.
경제학자이자
This
마샬
pushed the
플랜의
world into the Kinderberger
힌들버거의
trap,
이름을 딴
named after Charles
힌들버거
Kinderberger,
함정에
the economist
빠진
who was the
것입니다.
architect of the Marshall Plan.
조세프 나이 하버드대
Professor
교수는
Joseph Nye of
미중
Harvard
모두
University
각자
warns
보상의
that if
자국
both the
우선주의에
US and
사로잡혀
China neglect
공공재
providing
공급을
public goods
등한시할
due
경우
to
전
self-centered
세계가 다시
nationalism,
한번
it will push the
힌들버거
world once
함정에
again
빠질 수
into the
있다고
Kinderberger
경고하고
trap.
있습니다. 지금 우리가
The
겪고
ongoing
있는
Omicron
오미크론
crisis
위기는
is an
그
ominous sign
불길한
of
징후입니다.
that possibility.
미국은 지난주
Last week,
중국의
the
신장
United
인권
States
탄압을
officially
이유로
announced its
내년
diplomatic
2월에
boycott of
베이징
the Beijing Winter
동계올림픽의
Olympics
외교적
in February
보이콧을
next
공식
year,
선언했습니다.
denouncing China's human rights abuses
중국은
in Xinjiang.
미국은
China
잘못된
warned
길을
in
가고 있고
retaliation that the U.S.
그 행동의
will pay
대가를
for
치르게
its
될 것이라며
wrongdoing.
보복을 예고했습니다. 두 나라의
Tensions between
갈등은
the two
세력 교정이
countries will
끝나고
persist
새로운
until the power
균형에
struggle
도달될
between the two
때까지
sides reaches a
계속될
new
것입니다.
equilibrium.
미중 대결에서
If the
미국이
U.S.
승리할 경우
wins in the struggle
미국은
for power with
과거처럼
China,
관대한
there's little chance
대권국이
that will
되기
play the
어려울
role
것이고
of a benevolent
패배한
hegemon
중국은
as it did in the
위험한
past, while
이웃이
a
될
defeated
것입니다.
China will become a dangerous
미중 두
neighbor.
나라의 압도적인
The Republic
영향력에
of Korea,
고스란히
which is
노출되어
exposed to
있는
the
한국은
overpowering influence of the
확고한
two
자기
superpowers,
정체성을 갖고
has to
국가
define its
비전과
national vision
국익을
and interests
지정해야 합니다.
based on a solid
그래서
self-identity.
자강,
If
동맹,
South Korea manages
국제연대로
wisely with
지혜롭게
self-reliance,
대처하면
alliance,
미중의
and
존중을
international
받고
solidarity,
교량 역할을
it can
하는
become a pivot
중추국
state and a middle
중견
power which is
선진국이
respected
될 수
by both the
있습니다.
U.S. and China.
그러나 두
On
강대국의
the other
눈치나
hand,
보면서
if Seoul
그때그때
walks on
유리한 쪽으로
eggshells and
편성하는
keeps switching
식으로
position by turning to the
양쪽에서
advantageous side,
공격받는
it could be a target.
파쇄국으로
It could be targeted by
전락하게
both
됩니다.
countries and fall to a shadow
안보와
zone
경제를
state.
지킬 수
That
없습니다.
would make it
그런
impossible to
점에서
safeguard
다음
security
대통령
and the
임기
economy.
5년은
In this regard,
중차대한
the next president's
변환기이며
5-year term
향후
is a
100년
significant
한국의
turning point,
구분을
which could
좌우할
determine the
시기라고 할
fortunes of
것입니다.
Korea for the next 100 years.
한국은 세계
Korea is the only
유일의
divided
분단국입니다.
country in the world.
경제
The
대외
economy's
의존도
dependence on the
85%,
outside world is
에너지
85%,
수입 의존도
its dependence
97%,
on energy imports
곡물
is
자급률
97%, and its
24%,
grain self-sufficiency is
안보와
24%.
경제가 외부
Korea's
충격에
security and
모두
economy are
취약합니다.
both vulnerable to external
하지만
shocks.
한국은
However,
경제력 10위,
Korea ranks 10th in
기술력
economic
5위의
power and
세계
5th in
정상의
technology,
K 컨텐츠를
and is the source of
가진
K
나라입니다.
content, which is sweeping the world.
한미 동맹을 기초로
Building upon the ROK-US
한중
alliance,
협력
Korea should
동반자
maintain a
관계를
cooperative
조화롭게
partnership
유지하고
with China
다른 중견
and
국가들과
establish a global
글로벌
network
네트워크를
with other middle
구축하여
powers to
어떤
cope
상황에도
successfully
잘
with
대처할
any
수 있습니다.
situation.
한국도
Like Singapore,
싱가포르처럼
Korea
모두와
should keep to the
친구하고
principle of friend
모두
to all.
누구와도 적대하지 않기의
enemy to
원칙을 지키는 것이 좋습니다.
That way,
그래야
Korea
어느
can
누구도
prevent itself
만만하게 볼 수
from being
없는
relegated
나라가 됩니다.
to a pushover.
그런데
However,
문제는
the problem
남북
is
분단에
that there is
남남
very
갈등이
little
겹쳐
national
외교
consensus
안보
regarding
정책에
foreign
대한
and security
국민적
policies
합의
due to
매우
feuding within the
낮다는 데
country,
있습니다.
coupled with the division
폭풍우가
of the two
몰아치는데
Koreas.
목적지도
It is
없고
like setting
지도도
out to
없이
sea in a heavy
항해에 나선
storm without
형국입니다.
destination and no map.
이러면 국내에서는
This will result
정책
in
추진
loss of
동력을
momentum
잃고
for policy
상대국에 대한
implementation in Korea
협상력이
and
반감되고
have the bargaining power
외부로부터의
with other
간섭을
countries,
초래하게 됩니다.
which could result in
내년
outside
3월 9일에
interference.
선출되는
This is why
한국의 새
Korea's new
대통령이
president, who
4월을
will be
걸고
elected on March
남남
9th next
통합에
year,
나서야 하는
should make the utmost
절박한
efforts to
이유입니다.
bring the country together.
그래서 저는
Therefore,
내년에 새
I
정부가
propose
들어서면
creating a permanent consultative
상설
body
협의체를
within the National
제안합니다.
Assembly when the new
정파를
administration takes
초월한
office
국민적
next year.
합의를 바탕으로
Its main goal
정권
would be
교체와
to promote
무관하게
consistent foreign and security
외교
policies
안보 정책을
regardless of a change in
추진하기
government
위해서
based on national consensus that
추가적인 자원
transcends
투입
political
없이도
fractions.
한국의
This
외교
way,
역량을
Korea's diplomatic and
획기적으로
security capabilities
강화할
can
수
be strengthened dramatically without the injection of additional resources.
한국에게는 동맹인
Relations
미국과의
with the
관계가
United States
무엇보다
is
중요합니다.
paramount to South Korea,
한미 동맹이
and inter-Korean
튼튼해야
relations
남북
will work
관계도
out
잘
only
풀릴
when
수
the
있습니다.
ROK-US alliance is
김대중
strong.
대통령과
The historic
김정일의
summit between
역사적인
President Kim Dae-jung
정상회담이
and North Korean leader
성사된
Kim
것은
Jong-il was
클린턴
possible
미국 대통령과
because President Bill
김대중
Clinton and
대통령이
President Kim
서로를
trusted
신뢰했기
each other.
때문입니다. 기적같이
We must
찾아온
remember
독일 통일도
that reunification of
미국과의
Germany, which
관계가
came about
좋았기에
miraculously,
가능했다는
was also
사실을
possible
우리는
because of Germany's
기억해야
good
합니다.
relations with the United States.
미국과의 관계가 더
If
좋아지려면
relations with the United
미국이
States are to
그토록
become
원하는
better,
한일 관계
improvements
개선이
in
이루어져야
Korea-Japan
합니다.
relations, which the U.S. is keen on,
위안부
must be
강제징용
achieved.
문제가
The issue of
발목을
comfort
잡고
women
있습니다.
and forced labor is
한국은
holding back
일본에
Korea-Japan
배상을
ties.
요구하지 말고
Korea should
일본은
cease to
분명히
ask Japan
사과하는
for compensation,
미래에
and Japan should
지향적이고
apologize in a future-oriented
실용적인
and practical
방식으로 풀어야
manner.
합니다. 전후 프랑스와
We should keep
독일의
in
화해를
mind the
가져온
de Gaulle-Adenauer model, which brought reconciliation between France and Germany after the war, and the Kim Dae-jung-오비치 model in 1998.
여러분,
Ladies and gentlemen,
지구상에서
the
북한을
United
제대로
States is
변화시킬
the
수
only
있는
country
국가는
on earth
오직
that can make real
미국뿐입니다.
changes in North Korea.
김정은은 미국과의
Kim
관계
Jong-un
개선을
is eager to
간절히
improve relations
원하고
with the U.S.
있습니다. 그래야 중국,
This is because
베트남처럼
he
가난에서
believes North
벗어나
Korea can emerge
눈부신
from
경제
poverty
성장을 할 수
and achieve
있다고
remarkable
믿기
economic
때문입니다.
growth like China and Vietnam.
북한이 유엔 제재
The economic
국면에서
support that North
중국으로부터
Korea,
받고 있는
which is
자원
subject to
지원은
UN sanctions,
그저
is currently
연명시켜줄
receiving from
정도의
China
도움에
is just
불과합니다.
enough to keep North
북한의
Koreans
최고
alive.
지도자인 김정은은
North Korean leader Kim
2019년
Jong-un
하노이
has
북미
implored
정상회담에서
President Trump
영변
to lift
백지를
5 sanctions
내놓을
related to the North
인민
Korean
생활과
people's
관련된
livelihoods,
5가지
bargaining
제재를
his plans to
풀어달라고
dismantle
트럼프
the Yongbyon complex
대통령에게
at the 2019
매달려
North Korea-US summit in Hanoi.
북한이 미국과의
This
관계
indicates how
정상화에
firmly North
올인하고
Korea is
있음을
committed to
보여주는
normalizing relations
장면입니다.
with the United
북한은
States.
하노이 결렬
Even
이후에도
after the breakdown of
그의 6월
negotiations in
30일
Hanoi,
판문점
North Korea continued
남북미
engaging
한국
with the
정상회담
representatives of South Korea and the US in Panmunjom on June 30th and maintained working-level meetings in Stockholm, Sweden in
수시로
October that year.
미사일을 발사했지만
Although Pyongyang has fired missiles from time to
장거리
time,
미사일
it has
발사라는
not crossed the red
레드라인은
line
넘지
of
않고
nuclear
있습니다.
tests and long-range missile launches.
이건 무엇을 의미하는
What does this
것일까요?
imply?
북한이
It
미국과
implies that North
협상할
Korea
의지가
is willing
있다는
to
뜻입니다.
negotiate with the U.S.
미국은 이런
The
사정을
United
잘
States
활용하여
should make good use of
적극적으로
these
북한과
circumstances and
협상에
actively engage in negotiations with North Korea.
브레진스키 전
Former
미국
U.S. National Security
국가안보보좌관은
Advisor Brzezinski
1997년에
compared
저서
East Asia
거대한
to a
체스판에서
potential and political
동아시아 지역을
volcano in his book,
잠재적
The Giant
정치적
Chessboard,
화산에
published in
비유했습니다.
1997.
미국이 이
If the
상태를
U.S.
방치하면
leaves the current status
북한은
as is,
머지않아
North
100기가
Korea will
넘는
soon have an
핵무기를
arsenal of more than
보유하게
100 nuclear weapons.
만일 여기에
If
대응해서
South Korea
한국,
and
일본이
Japan
자위적
respond
차원에서
by arming
핵무장을 하고
themselves with nuclear
중국이
weapons in
핵을
self-defense,
증강할
and if
경우
China
베트남
builds
대만의
up its
핵무장도
nuclear arsenal,
시간 문제.
it is only a question of time
아시아
before
전체가
Vietnam and Taiwan
그야말로 핵 도미노
also
상태에
take the
빠지게
nuclear
되고
route. Asia as a
정치적,
whole will fall
군사적
into a nuclear
화산이
domino
됩니다.
to become a political and
공들여
military
지켜온
volcano.
핵 확산
The
금지조약 체제가
non-proliferation treaty
붕괴됩니다.
system, which we worked so
이것은
hard to
미국도
safeguard, will fall
원치
apart.
않은
This is
일입니다.
not what the U.S. would want.
북한도 지금보다
North Korea
더
must also
적극적이고
display a
진지한
more
협상의
proactive and
자세를
sincere
보여야
approach
합니다.
to negotiations
세계
than what we are
최강국인
seeing
미국과
now.
협상하면서
It must abandon
완벽한
the
승리를
avarice of pushing
거두려는
for
과욕은
perfect victory in
거두어드려야 합니다.
negotiations with the world's greatest
미국에서는
superpower,
북한과의
the U.S.
협상은 끝없는
There's a
수독에
deep
빠지는
sense of
것이라는
fatigue in the
피로감이
U.S. when it comes to
쌓일 대로
dealing with
쌓여
North
있는
Korea, a
상태입니다.
sense that negotiating with
북한은
Pyongyang is
줄건
like
주고
falling
받을 건
into a
받는
bottomless pit.
과감하고
So North
유연한
Korea must take
자세를
on a bold and
가져야 합니다.
flexible approach where it
시간이
gives
많이
what it
남아
must
있지
and
않습니다.
takes what it can.
아무리
Time is running out.
핵무기가 많아도
Having stockpiles of
국민의
nuclear weapons
생활이
does
나아질
not
수는
mean a
없습니다.
better life for the people.
한국은
Korea
4대
is
강국에
also
둘러싸인
the
세계
only
유일의
country in the
나라이고
world surrounded by
그것도
4
모자라
powerful nations.
분단국이며
As if that
미중
weren't enough,
세력 경쟁의
it is divided,
한복판에 놓여
and at the
있습니다.
very center of the competition for
기가
power
막힌
between the U.S. and
현실입니다.
China, this
국제
is the
정치학의
dumbfounding
석파
reality.
존
Chicago
미어샤이머
University professor
사고됐습니다.
John Mearsheimer
전
pointed out
세계에서
South
지정학적으로
Korea
가장
and
불리한
Poland
위치에 있는
as the
나라로
two countries in the world
한국과
with the worst
폴란드를
geopolitical circumstances.
그는
In his
저서
book,
강대국
The
정치의
Tragedy of
비밀에서
Great Power Politics,
한국 국민에게
Professor Mearsheimer
한치의
says
실수도
the
용납되지
Korean
않는
people are living
지정학적
in a
환경에
political environment
살고
that does
있다.
not allow a
모든
single
국민이
mistake.
영리하게
He says every
전략적으로
citizen
사고해야
has to
한다.
think smart and
생존과
strategically
직결되어
as it
있다.
is linked directly
조언했습니다.
to their survival.
우리가 잠시도
This is why we
긴장을
cannot
늦출 수
afford to
없는
rest
이유입니다.
easy.
우리가 국익
If we are
우선주의와
to stick to the principles of national interest and strategic flexibility,
스스로
we have to stand strong on our own 2 feet.
그러기에 내부
For that to
통합이
happen,
절실합니다.
we're in dire need of
그래야
integration.
개방국가,
Then only
공산국가,
can we become an
세계
open
국가가
nation,
될 수
a
있습니다.
strong trading nation, and a
다자주의를
truly
통해
global
강대국의
nation.
경쟁을
Through multilateralism,
완축시킬
it can
수
be a
있습니다.
buffer in the competition
대륙과
between
해양을 연결해
superpowers. By linking the
동북아
continental and maritime spheres, it can lead peace and prosperity for Northeast Asia and
이런
the world.
역할을 하려면
In
먼저
order to
우리가
take on this
완전히
role, we first
달라져야
must
합니다.
make some dramatic changes.
오늘 토론을 통해서
And so today,
대한민국을
I hope
이끌어갈
through the
새
discussions
대통령의
here, we will be
외교
able
안보
to
정책
present
방향이
a clear idea
통합적
of the foreign affairs and security
제시
policy
되기를
direction of the next president
기대합니다.
of Korea.
경청해
Thank you very much
주셔서
for your attention.
감사합니다. Now I'd like to turn the microphone to John Hamley in Washington.
Dr. Hong,
Yes, nice
good
to meet
evening
you.
from Washington. Good morning in Seoul.
Yeah.
It is so nice to be able to see you. I'm so sad that we have to be separated by COVID again. It's always the highlight of my year to be able to come to Seoul. It's my second home, to come to Seoul and to share, the very good conversations we always have that JoongAng makes possible. I always admire the thoughtfulness that JoongAng puts into this conference and to frame issues in such an important way. And I thought your remarks tonight were excellent. You gave us so much to think about, and I'm very grateful for your comments. As was stated earlier, you have an election coming up in Korea, and we have an election in Washington in a year. It's a congressional election, and so our political environments are a bit frozen. But that shouldn't keep us from thinking about the future, the way you outlined in your speech. We should be anticipating the important issues that will be facing our two countries together. This last year, we knew that we were going to face this period of transition, not knowing where your election will take you, not certain where our politics is taking us. So a group of very thoughtful Americans came together with us at CSIS, and we collaborated with the Che Foundation to think about this alliance, the Korea-U.S. alliance, and to reflect on it, and to think about the directions that we should be taking. It's a good report, but I would like to share what I consider to be the most important dimension of that report, and that is a very strong call on our part, American part, to broaden and to refresh our alliance. The alliance is strong and it's solid, but we need to rethink it, I believe. We need to move past the perception that the Korea-U.S. alliance is an anti-China alliance. We need to think about it in a different way. We need to widen the aperture of the alliance so that the alliance is fit for purpose for the next 30 years, not just a reflection of the last 50 years. So in doing this, we argued strongly that Korea and the United States should be focusing on a larger program of strengthening Asia in general and to provide more public goods in the region. Chairman Hong referred to Korea seeing itself as a rising middle power. I don't think of it that way. I think Korea is a global power. It's got the 10th largest economy. As Chairman Hong identified, it ranks number 5 in innovation, inventing new ideas. Korea is a global power, but Korea doesn't think of itself as a global power. And that should be part of our shared purpose in redefining and widening the aperture of this alliance to think of this working together in a much larger way on problems that the world has that we uniquely can make a significant contribution to. We outlined some of those. We believe that public health, global public health, is a major opportunity for Korea and the United States to jointly develop stronger programs that'll be good for everybody in the world. Chairman Hong said in his comments that America was underperforming its leadership role in global health, in fighting against COVID. We should do this together. These are things that we should be working on together. On environment, Korea has enormous capacities in inventing new things. America is going to become a country that drives electric vehicles, but all of the car batteries are going to be Korean car batteries. Korea has a huge opportunity to be a leader in the world here. We need to think about how we can broaden and diversify and make more resilient the supply chains for both of our economies, so that we're not dependent on choke points. We experienced some of those during the pandemic. So there are so many things that we can and should be doing to widen the aperture of this alliance between Korea and the United States. We have issues that we carry from the past. Dr. Hong mentioned some of those issues, but I hope that we focus on widening, modernizing, and strengthening a shared vision of a new future. What is the alliance going to do for the next 30 years? That should be the goal for our conversations. I know we're going to focus on some very immediate issues in this conference, but I hope we'll have a vision in our mind about a longer-term horizon for a stronger, bigger, more effective and engaged Korea, and a Korea and a U.S. partnership that represents our the importance that both of us have for each other, and where we contribute to each other, not a big brother, little brother relationship, but a side-by-side relationship. I think that's very possible, and that should be our vision going forward. So I thank you. I want to thank JoongAng and the remarkable people at JoongAng for bringing this together. You, Dr. Hong, I want to thank you for your personal leadership. We heard it earlier in your opening remarks, and for what you've been doing consistently through your career. Let's listen carefully to these panels that we've convened for tonight and listen about the opportunities that we can have as partners designing a stronger, broader, more fresh alliance between Korea and the United States. Thank you very much for letting me be a part of this.
네, 홍석형 회장님의 개회사와 존
So we heard Chairman Hong and Dr. Henry for their opening remarks. We're having the JoongAng CSIS Forum 2021, and we'd like to begin session 1 under the title of Korea's Survival Equation in the Era of U.S.-China Confrontation. The session will be moderated by Dr. Yoon.
네, 반갑습니다.
Pleased to meet you. Thank you very much to our two U.S. panelists for your participation despite COVID-19. Pleased to meet you. And thank you to the three Korean panelists here with us today. We will introduce you as we proceed. As we have heard from Chairman Hong and Dr. Henry, we will be discussing the Biden era and Korea's global strategy. Thank you for sharing with us your insights. The topic for session 1 is Korea's survival equation in the era of U.S.-China confrontation. So the topic is survival equation, but I believe that it will be an opportunity for us to take a look at Korea's role in this new great transition after the 30 years of the post-Cold War era. So I would like to interpret survival equation as a way to gather our wisdom for the role of Korea Korea. Currently, there are many factors impacting our strategies, but the G2 strategic competition overpowers all factors. The strategic engagement for China by the U.S. has ended after 40 years, and it seems that there is outright competition rather than cooperation in all areas, including economy, technology, diplomacy, military, ideology, and values. Especially, it seems as if the Indo-Pacific has become the front lines. Both the leaders of the U.S. and China are looking into a long-term competition, and the Innovation and Competition Act of the U.S. is presenting in the coming decades. And so, given this great transition, we will take a look at the challenges of the allies of the U.S. in this situation. Especially, Korea has a comprehensive strategic alliance with the U.S. and also a strategic cooperative partnership with China. And so, with more areas of competition and confrontation between the G2, we have more policy concerns. So during the Biden administration and the next Korean administration, how wise will Korea be in having our regional and global policies that will actually be the foundation for our future? In this volatile era, we wish to gather our wisdom for Korean diplomacy by gathering a panel of the best experts in the U.S.-Korea relations. We will take a look at the changing volatile situations as well as the strategic diplomacy of Korea that will impact the big framework. We will also listen to the representatives of the two presidential candidate camps to take a look at their future policies. We will then follow this up with some more detailed discussions on policies. We will be first inviting Dr. Mike Green from CSIS because he has received a prestigious award for his book. Congratulations. So he will talk to us about Biden administration's policy for China and implications for Korea. Dr. Green?
Thank you very much, former Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se. Good to see you. We worked together a long time ago in Washington, and I'm also, like many Americans who are following the election in Korea, so pleased and reassured to see that the two presidential candidates are being advised by the best and brightest, by my good friends Wee Sung-lak and Kim Sung-han, who are well known in Washington and around the world for their experience and strategic wisdom. I was asked to introduce the direction of U.S.-China strategic competition. I think if you're in Washington, you can see we also at CSIS have done surveys of the general public and of elite thought leaders. And you can see that there's a very robust consensus about China right now in the United States. Maybe not 100%, but 80, 90% generally agree in Washington on what we are facing. First, they agree that we are in an era of strategic rivalry with China, one that the United States did not seek, but under Xi Jinping, China thrust upon us with increasing coercion against neighboring states and a crackdown on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and dissent within China. Second, there's a broad consensus now that we need to respond to this challenge not alone, but by doubling, tripling, quadrupling our cooperation with allies like Korea. In 2012, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs asked Americans how to respond to China almost a decade ago, and most said by forming a G2 with China, even if it hurts relations with allies. Today, in those polls and in polls by CSIS, somewhere between 2/3 and 80% of Americans or American thought leaders say we should respond to China's challenge by strengthening our cooperation with allies, even if it hurts our relations with China, not by forming a G2. Fourth, there is a broad consensus that where possible, the United States should cooperate with China on interests that affect humanity. The most obvious case is climate change. But after President Biden's 3.5-hour virtual meeting with Xi Jinping recently, the U.S. and China have begun dialogues in a variety of areas, including the pandemic, and strategic stability or nuclear or military issues. These won't fundamentally change the strategic competition, but it shows that both sides know there needs to be a floor under the competition. What does this mean for Korea? I think it means a great deal. In fact, I think perhaps after North Korea, this is the most important foreign policy question for the two presidential candidates. The first thing I would say is, in Washington, this is not viewed as a G2 or a bipolar US-China issue. Asia is increasingly multipolar, and the decisions of countries like Korea, Australia, India, Japan, Indonesia are incredibly important. None of these countries want Chinese hegemony to replace American leadership in Asia. And so this is a critical question for Korea, just as it is for Korea's neighbors. But there's one very striking difference. Australia, Japan, India are cooperating together in a plurilateral way, not to contain or stop China, but to reinforce Asia, as Dr. Henry said, to provide public goods, to make Asia more resilient, cooperating on infrastructure financing, on capacity building so that the Philippines or Vietnam have awareness of their maritime surroundings, cooperating on governance or democracy support, cooperating on maritime security. It is very conspicuous to Australia, to the United States, to Japan, to India, that Korea is not part of that team. Korea is doing as much as any of these countries, bilaterally, with foreign aid, with capacity building, with diplomacy, to invest in Asia. But it's doing it alone. It's doing it bilaterally, or in the case of the new Southern policy with the United States, bilaterally, but not part of this grouping of middle and major powers committed to a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think one of the most important questions for the next presidential candidate in Korea is it in Korea's interest to continue self-isolating within Asia in this way? Or is it better for Korea to join this team and be part of a plurilateral effort of like-minded countries who share common interests and values with the people of Korea? And a similar question that should be asked is this good for Korean security on the Korean Peninsula? Is Korea's current strategic ambiguity policy giving Seoul more leverage with Beijing or less? I would argue less leverage. And that puts Korea in a weaker diplomatic position vis-a-vis North Korea. But these are important questions. I think everyone in Washington who follows this alliance understands that Korea has a different geographic and security situation from states like Japan or Australia or India that are removed from the continent of Asia. But the questions are no less important, and I look forward to hearing my friends from the two presidential camps help us understand what the thinking will be when a new administration takes over in a few months. Thank you.
네, 지금 그린 박사님께서
Thank you, Dr. Green.
Yes, Dr. Green has pointed out various efforts of plurilateralism, and he also pointed out that it seems that Korea is not participating in this team with strategic ambiguity. And he mentioned these points, and currently multilateralism by the Biden administration is becoming quite active, and so we need to keep this in mind. So keeping this statement in mind, we will now turn to former Vice Minister Shin Gak-soo, and he has been very active in foreign policies, including policies with Japan. So in Korea, what is your opinion concerning these transitions?
Thank you very much. I would first like to express my appreciation to the JoongAng Ilbo and organizers for inviting me. I am also very happy to be connected virtually with panel members from the U.S. Thank you very much. In his initial remarks, Dr. Green talked about the ROK-U.S. relations and the alliance, and I share a lot of his view, but from Korea's perspective, I'd like to discuss how this G2 competition will play out and what Korea needs to do in response to these changes. And that's the topic that I'd like to discuss in my initial remarks. As you may know, the strategic competition between the U.S. and China is well underway, and I can say that the Biden administration is playing this competition in a more sophisticated manner. And it seems that the U.S. has acknowledged that connecting with China has not been very successful, and under President Trump's government, there was a dominant view of defining China as a revisionist. And in response to this, China has declared a China Dream, and they aim to become a strong country that can overrun the U.S. by 2050, and they are implementing very aggressive foreign and security policies. It is my understanding that this G2 competition and confrontation will continue well into the future for the next 20 or 30 years, unless there are major dramatic changes within each of these countries. And it is very likely that President Xi will continue his power. And so for the next couple of decades, there will be competition and confrontation between the two countries. And in the areas of climate change and pandemic and non-proliferation, as Dr. Green mentioned, they may pursue cooperation for these global issues. And in addition, the Biden administration is putting emphasis on alliance and value-based diplomacy and multilateral diplomacy. And we need to see how these attempts will bring about changes in the relations between the U.S. and China. But at the same time, we need to remember that there are many domestic issues and foreign policy issues that the two countries need to address. For instance, the approval rating of President Biden has been declining, and they will have the midterm elections very soon. And Xi Jinping is focusing on achieving political stability as his third term is just about to begin. And China also needs to address this irony between common prosperity and virtual cycle. And as for foreign policy issues, the U.S. is trying to revitalize alliances and revitalize its domestic economy, but there may be some thorny issues, including the Afghan issues and the launch of AUKUS, and there were some issues that had to be ironed out. And as for China, there are these negative views about China with respect to warrior diplomacy and the negative side effects of the Belt and Road Initiative. In my view, some people call this overall landscape as the new Cold War, but I do not think this is appropriate. We cannot call the situation a new Cold War because the current circumstances are very different from what we had in the beginning of the 20th century. So we need to avoid calling the current situation as a new Cold War. So rather, I can say that the current landscape can be defined as great power competition, mainly in the areas of military and technology. I'd like to also discuss the extent of decoupling between the U.S. and China. With fierce competition between the two superpowers, there's an increasing nexus of economy and security centering on high-tech and fourth Industrial Revolution-related technologies and strategic goods, and the U.S. is trying to reshuffle and restructure its supply chain for the purpose of security. In response to this, China has announced China Manufacture 2025, and it is promoting 10 strategic industries. So China is quite active in pursuing decoupling with the U.S. in terms of its industries and supply chains. In addition, there were some rhetorics that have been heating up in terms of Taiwan and South China Sea and East China Sea and over the Korean Peninsula. Because of these intensifying rhetorics, we can see that there are increasing risks of confrontation and conflict in these areas in the region. So we need to find and come up with a modus operandi ways to manage the current situation in Asia to prevent any accidental conflicts. So this modus operandi is something that we need to develop together to manage the current situation given the G2 competition. Going forward, the US and China will need to address their own issues. And depending on how successful they are in addressing the current pending issues, and depending on how successful they are in terms of coming up with effective diplomatic and foreign policy and military policies, the G2 competition or confrontation may be played out in a different manner. Overall, I believe that the U.S. is in a more advantageous position because the U.S. is still has much more influence over China in terms of geography, population, innovation, and global currency and finance, alliance, and military. But at the same time, China has been growing its economy. So while the U.S. will continue to maintain upper hand, such competition and confrontation may persist for some time. But when it comes to East Asia, as for this particular region, I believe that there will be rather balanced power between the U.S. and China because China is located in East Asia. Given these circumstances, as Dr. Green mentioned, the U.S. is pursuing a more open Indo-Pacific, and Korea can join in such initiatives as a key stakeholder. So Korea can play a role in these regional initiatives led by the U.S. But at the same time, these may lead to some potential conflicts with China. Therefore, we should not approach this as a matter of choice or taking sides, but rather we need to address issues on an issue-by-issue basis. And we also need to understand that all these issues are not a zero-sum game. So we need to be flexible and we need to take a holistic approach that encompasses various related factors. We know for sure that the U.S. is our ally and China is our strategic cooperative partner. So that is the beginning stance. And based on this, we will continue to pursue our national interests. So for each issue, we will have to consider our national interests, our national value, and principles in a holistic manner. As Chairman Hong mentioned, we need to have a clear self-identity. We are divided and we have high reliance on external economy and import and export. But as Dr. Henry mentioned, Korea is a strong country. It is ranked 10th in terms of economy and 5th in terms of technology and innovation. So we need to take into account these various aspects. And I think we need to put more priority on security over economy and technology over market. So based on that principle, we need to be more holistic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Ambassador Shen. So we have heard from Dr. Green and Ambassador Shen, and they both talked about their opinions on the current situation of the U.S. and China. In particular, Ambassador Shen talked about how if there is heightened confrontation, there could be threat of military confrontation. And so the modus operandi is necessary, is what he pointed out. In particular, concerning the role of Korea, he talked about the position that we should be taken, but at the same time, how we need a position in a case-by-case format. And we should take a look at this in detail throughout the panel. So we are here to talk about what if there is aggravated confrontation between the U.S. and China, that we could go to a worst-case scenario. I think the person that we need to turn to is the Director of China Power Project at CSIS, Dr. Bonnie Lin. So we will now turn the floor to Dr. Bonnie Lin to take a look at what are some possible scenarios in the future that may become quite difficult, and how would these scenarios impact Korea?
Minister Yun, thank you very much. And as you mentioned, I want to build on my colleague Mike Green's remarks and examine some of the difficult choices South Korea may face if U.S.-China competition intensifies. So I tend to use my time to actually raise questions regarding South Korea's foreign policy to help illustrate the complex environment that Seoul will be navigating. I actually don't have answers to any of my questions, but I think these questions are worth considering when we're thinking about how South Korea might navigate its policy in the context of intensified U.S.-China competition. So one of the first issues I want to talk about is looking at what the positions that South Korea might take in terms of regional flashpoints. There's currently quite a bit of a debate within Washington, D.C. about China's trajectory in the coming years, particularly after Chinese President Xi Jinping assumes his third term in power this fall. This was mentioned by both of the speakers beforehand. Some have called the next 10 years the critical decade in China's development. A number of folks in the United States are worried that China may have incentives to use military force against one of its neighbors. Most notably, Taiwan has been discussed at length in the United States. We see that China continues to grow and modernize its military capabilities at a rapid pace. The 2021 DoD report on China's military power assesses that by 2027, if China's military reforms go well, China will have greater confidence to engage in complex and larger scale military contingencies, including contingencies involving Taiwan. So I think a critical question for South Korea is what position will Seoul take in a regional flashpoint involving China and one of its neighbors, whether that's in Taiwan, whether that's involving Japan, or in the South China Sea, or on the China-India border. I think this question will become more pressing if the United States were to intervene against China in this hypothetical regional crisis or conflict. I mean, one can make the case that it's not useful to think about these situations hypothetically, and maybe South Korea could decide on a case-by-case basis. I think to some extent that is true, but if we are assuming that U.S.-China relations have worsened, it's possible that inaction on part of South Korea could be viewed as the ROK siding with China. I think there will be lots of domestic pressure within the United States and serious questioning of the U.S.-ROK alliance if that was to occur. It might also be possible in a serious, larger regional crisis or conflict that there may be little room for the ROK to maneuver that allows it to stay neutral viewed by both the United States and China. The second topic I want to cover was covered quite a bit already, was regional groupings and partnerships, and what that means in terms of how South Korea positions itself in the future. So on the U.S. side, as Mike has talked about, the Biden administration very much prioritizes our allies and partners. So we're likely to see not only strengthened bilateral relationships, but the growing role of multinational groupings to bring together like-minded allies and partners. So we talked a bit about AUKUS as well as about the Quad. So key question for South Korea is, would Seoul be willing to join or become associated with any of these groupings, particularly as the possibility that in intensified U.S.-China competition, China is likely to view many of these groups as anti-China, regardless of how the Quad brands itself. On the Chinese side, we're likely to see that China is also responding to what it views as a more unstable and hostile external environment by strengthening its own partnerships, including with North Korea and with Russia. We know that China renewed its treaty with North Korea this year and has stated that its relationship with Russia has no upper limits. China and Russia are pushing for a number of things at the United Nations, including lifting sanctions on North Korea. the two countries are also engaging in more military exercises and operations near South Korea. It's possible as we move into the future in an intensified US-China environment that China will increase and strengthen its relationships with Russia and North Korea. So the key question for Seoul then is, how do you respond to these dynamics? Will these dynamics push South Korea closer to the United States, or will Seoul feel a greater need to work with China and Russia given the increased relationship those two countries might have with North Korea? The third variable or factor that I wanted to discuss was also mentioned earlier, which is values, and particularly value-based diplomacy. So as US-China competition intensifies, we'll likely see clear articulation of values on both the US side as well as on the Chinese side. We'll likely see on the US side more initiatives like the Summit for Democracy, and more US sanctions on China, North Korea, and other actors for human rights violations. We'll also see more actions by the United States to boycott Chinese activities or Chinese events that are against US values, including, for example, the recent US boycott of the Winter Olympics in China. Similarly, we'll see China reacting to these events and likely Chinese response to include sanctioning these activities that it views as damaging Chinese core interest. So a question for Seoul is, and this is the question that Seoul has already faced, is how will you position yourself on these issues? Will you decide on a case-by-case basis, or is there a larger framework to anchor individual decisions around? So in the interest of time, I'll wrap up here, but I just want to summarize. In terms of thinking about Seoul's future foreign policy, it's important to think about at least three different variables. Number one, what role South Korea will play in potential regional contingencies involving China and the United States outside of the Korean Peninsula. Two, how South Korea will position itself given the changing regional architecture. And the third one, how South Korea will position itself in US-China competition in a setting of, given when it comes to setting international values and norms. So let me wrap up here. Thank you.
네, 린 박사님 감사드립니다. 특히 이제
Thank you very
미중 경쟁
much,
관계가
Dr.
더 악화되는
Lin,
방향으로 나갔을
and
때
especially when
당국이
the
어떤
US-China
역할을
relations
해야 되는지에
become worse,
대해서
and if
구체적인
there's
방향과
intense
또
competition,
현안 이슈까지도
there are
지적을
several
해주셨습니다.
specific factors we need
특히
to
이제
include and
그
consider.
한국이
So thank you
이러한
very much
경쟁이
for your
심해진
valuable
미중
remarks,
경쟁이 심해질 경우에
especially when there's
한국이 이제
intensifying competition
머니터링할 수
between
있는
the US and
룸이
China.
아주 적다 하는 그
There's not much
말씀,
room
또
for Korea to
누구에게
maneuver
다가갈
given
것이냐는 그런
these
측면,
situations
다자적인
and what
그런
role
이제
can we
연합을 어떻게
play
우리가
and
다 활용할
what
것이냐는
role
그런
can we
문제에
play in
대해서
terms
잘
of
지적해
regional
주시면서
groupings.
케이스 바이 케이스로
And,
접근할 것이냐
You raised the question of whether we need to approach on a case-by-cases or a larger or high-level framework. So your remarks gave us a lot of food for thought. And now I'd like to invite the two chief foreign policy advisors of the two presidential campaigns. And they're going to offer an overall direction of forein policies of each presidential camp. So first of all, I'd like to invite Lee Sung-lak, Chairman of the Pragmatic Foreign Affairs Committee at the Presidential Campaign for Lee Jae-myung, and he's going to be discussing the overall geopolitical and geoeconomic situations from the perspective of the presidential candidate and overall policy direction. Please go ahead.
네, 윤병세 장관님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Minister Yoon.
귀한 자리에 초청해 주신
I would also like to thank the JoongAng Ilbo and CSIS for inviting me to this very meaningful forum. And it is my great pleasure to meet my longtime friend, Dr. Green and Dr. Hamri.
제가 오늘 이재명 후보의
I'm here as the chairman of Pragmatic Foreign Affairs Committee of the Presidential Campaign for Lee Jae-myung. So I'd like to discuss our policy directions, and I would also like to try to offer my answers to the questions that were posed by the other panel members. Now, there's intensifying competition between the US and China, which is a major challenge to Korea, and the overall security and foreign affairs landscape is becoming more and more challenging. So, given these realities, the candidate Lee Jae-myung would like to turn this challenge into an opportunity. So basically, there are four main points
국익 중심.
First of all, we will
둘째는
focus on our national
실행주의.
interest. Second, we'll focus on pragmatism. And
마지막으로는
number three
선진
is
외교입니다.
promoting
이러한
social
기조가
unity.
이중
And number
경쟁과 대립
four
속에서
is
이재명
promoting
외교를 끌고 갈
advanced diplomacy
가이드라고 할 수
and foreign
있습니다.
affairs policies. These are the four main
이재명
points
후보는
of the
이데올로그가
policy
아닌
direction.
현실주의자입니다.
And
그리고
candidate Lee Jae-myung is a
1,300만
pragmatic
인구를 가진
person.
거대한
And
지방 정부를 운영해 본
he
경험이
had
있는
experience of serving
프랙티셔너입니다.
this very big
그는
province
그동안의 경륜을
with more
바탕으로
than 13
이러한
million
과업을
population.
수행할
So
준비가 되어
he has a
있습니다.
lot of experience as
아까도
a policy
발제자 중에서 한
administrator.
분이 간략히
So he's
지적하셨는데
basically a pragmatic
한국에게는 미중 경쟁이
approach.
북한 핵 문제에 못지않은
And
시급하고
he believes
중차대한 문제입니다.
that U.S.-China
북한의 핵
competition
문제를
is as important and as
다음과 같은
urgent as the
고질점에
nuclear
비유할 수 있다면
issue of North Korea.
미중 경쟁과 대립 시대를 헤쳐가야
So,
되는 한국에게는
As Korea has to
미중 경쟁은
navigate through this
벼랑
G2
끝을 걷는
competition,
것과도 같습니다.
it is almost as if
한
we're
걸음만
walking on the
잘못하면
brinks of
크게 다칠
the
수가
cliff.
있습니다.
And if we make one
근데
small
그동안의
mistake, it
한국은
may lead to a disastrous
동맹인
outcome.
미국과 부상하는 중국
So far,
사이에서
between the
사안별로
existing ally of
대처해온
the
감이
U.S.
있습니다.
and the rising
그런데 미중
China,
경쟁이
Korea has
심해지면서
been
양측이
taking the
한국을
approach of a
반기는 힘도 더욱
case-by-case
강해지고 있는
stance,
중입니다.
but I
그래서
think that there are
사안별로
intensifying national
대처하기가
interests
점점 더
that are at
어려워지고
stake.
있습니다.
So a case-by-case
그런데
approach
우리가
is
미국과
not
중국
necessarily
사이에서
effective.
소심하고 회피적으로
And
자세를
if
취할수록
we are to
자기
take a
충족적인
more
예언처럼
passive
대처가
approach,
더 어려워질
then
소지가
this
있습니다.
will create a more difficult
그래서
situation for Korea.
우리는 아주
So
간명한 사실로부터 출발하는
I
게
believe that we need to start from the very
바람직하다고
obvious
봅니다.
facts.
Simply 간단하게 말해서
Simply
미국은
put,
동맹이고
first of all, the
중국은
U.S. is our
동맹에
ally,
미치지
and China
못하는
is not our
동반자입니다.
ally. China is
또
just
가치
a partner.
측면에서
And
미국은
from the
우리와 많은
value
것을
perspective,
공유합니다.
the U.S. and Korea share a lot
이재명
of
후보가
values.
자주
And
언급하듯이
as presidential
한국은
candidate
지난
Lee
70여
Jae-myung
년
mentioned
동안
many times,
국가 발전을
the ROK
위해 노력해오면서 그 과정에서 미국과 동맹을
maintained
유지하고
an alliance with
미국과
the
유사한
U.S. for the
가치를
past
지향해왔습니다.
7 decades, and we
그래서
have promoted the same
식민지로부터
values.
경제
And
발전을
by
이루고
doing so, Korea was able
민주주의까지
to
달성한
overcome the
세계
colonial
유일의 나라가
past
되었습니다.
and become an
이재명
industrialized
후보는
and
이
democratic
과정에서 미국이
country.
한국에 준 많은
And in
도움과
this
지원에
entire
대해서 항상
process,
감사한
Lee
입장을
Jae-myung
표명해
really
오고 있습니다.
appreciates all the support and
그렇기
assistance
때문에
that has
한국이
been
앞으로
provided by the U.S.
나가야
to
될
Korea.
방향은
Therefore,
이러한 성취와
given
정체성을
this past
반영하는 것이어야
achievements
것입니다.
and progress and the
한국
self-identity
외교의
of
좌표와
Korea, we
방향은
need to take
미국과
a future
가깝게
direction.
미국과 함께
So overall,
갈
in our
수밖에
foreign
없습니다.
policies, we need to
다만
be more
지리적으로
aligned with the
인접하고
U.S.
경제적으로 중요하고
However,
또
China is
한반도의 평화,
geographically closer
안정과
to
통일
Korea
과정에
and
영향을 미칠
has
수
a lot of
있는
economic ties.
중국과도
And
좋은
China
관계를
may
유지해야
have
합니다.
important
요컨대
influence in the
이재명
process of
정부의
unification of the Korean
정책은
Peninsula. So we need to
미중의
maintain
경쟁 구도
friendly
속에서
relations with
한미 동맹을
China.
바탕으로 중국과의 관계를
Given this G2 competition,
나간다는
the
것입니다.
Lee
이렇게
Jae-myung
해서
government would like to
미국과
base
중국
its
사이에서
position
한국이
on the
취하는
ROK-US
정책의
alliance
일관성,
while promoting
일체성,
better
예측
relations with
가능성을
China.
높여갈 것입니다.
And by
그렇게 되면
taking and following this principle, we
한국의
would
외교
like to
좌표에 대한 이해가
increase
깊어지고
the
또 기대치가 조정이
consistency
돼서
and
한국의
alignment
대미
and
대중 관계가
predictability
좀 더
of Korean foreign
안정될 것으로
policies
기대합니다.
as it is positioned between the
다음으로는
U.S. and
제가
China.
간략하게
Next,
동맹, 한일
I'd like
관계,
to
한미일
discuss
협력,
the
인도
U.S.
태평양
ROK
전략에
U.S.
대해서
alliance,
이재명 후보의
Korea's
입장을
relations with
소개하겠습니다.
Japan, as well as the
먼저 한미
multilateral
동맹인데요. 이재명 후보는
cooperation.
현행
As for
한미
ROK
동맹의
U.S.
중요성에
alliance,
대한 확고한
Lee
인식을 가지고
Jae-myung
있습니다.
has a strong
그는 한미
belief
동맹이
of the
안보를
importance of
넘어서
ROK U.S. alliance.
경제,
It is
기술,
not just a
환경 등
security
다양한
alliance,
분야에서 협력을
but it
아우르는
is an alliance that
포괄적인 관계로
encompasses
발전해야 된다고 생각합니다.
economic and other spheres.
한일 관계에
So this
대해서
has to
이재명
become more
후보는
comprehensive. And as
현재
for our
악화된 관계를
relations with
조속히
Japan,
개선해야 된다고 믿고 있고
he believes that we need to
이것을
improve
위해서
our relations with
김대중
Japan
오부치
as
모델을
quickly as possible. So he
참고로
would like to
삼아서
refer to the Kim
그러한
Dae-jung
관계로
Obuchi
발전시켜
model in
가겠다고 하고
1998.
있습니다. 당선이 되면은 취임
And when he's
초부터 한일 관계
elected,
개선에
from the
역점을
very
둘
beginning,
것입니다.
he's going to focus on improving
한미일
ties with
협력인데요.
Japan. And as for ROK-US
한미
cooperation,
동맹과 미일 동맹을 고리로 하는 한미일
we
협력의
have,
중요성에 대해서 이재명
he
후보의
understands the
생각은
importance
확고합니다.
of trilateral
무엇보다도
cooperation
한미일
among
협력이
Korea, the US, and
북한의 핵
Japan
모험주의에
based
대한
on our
억지로
bilateral
역으로 작용하면서
alliances,
동북아
because
평화
this
안정에
trilateral
기여할 뿐만 아니라
alliance
지금
will serve as a
동아시아 인도
deterrence
태평양 지역에서 벌어지고
to
있는
any
여러 가지
military
세력 변화
confrontations, and also
다이나믹스에
this
한국이
trilateral
적절히
alliance
대처하는 데
will
큰
allow
기반이 된다고 믿습니다.
Korea to become play a more
기술
important role in the
신선도국인
region.
한미일 간의 협력이
And also, as
21세기의
the
새로운
three
도전이라고 할
countries
수
are
있는
leaders in
경제 안보
technology,
문제에
they will
대처하는
be
데 있어서도
able
아주
to
효과적이고
cooperate more
유용하다고 봅니다.
effectively in dealing with all these technology and economic
인도
issues that
태평양
may arise in the
전략입니다.
21st
이재명
century.
후보는
Moving on to
미국의
the
인도 태평양
Indo-Pacific
전략이 지향하는
strategy,
목표나 가치가
이재명
자신의 외교 가치와 외교
understands
기조에
and believes
일치하는 부분이
that the
많다고
values and
생각합니다.
approaches of
또
the
한국
Indo-Pacific
외교가
region pursued by the
한반도와
U.S. are
동북아를
very
넘어서
much in line with the
글로벌화를
beliefs
지향하는
and
데 있어서도
values of
많은
Lee Jae-myung.
가능성과
And
기회를
also he
제공한다고
sees much
생각합니다.
potential of utilizing the
잠깐 이 대목에서
Indo-Pacific
쿼드에
strategy.
대한 이재명 후보의
And
입장을
in
소개하면
this
이재명
respect, I'd like to
후보는
talk about the Quad issue.
미국의 동맹인 한국이 쿼드와 어떤
Korea
형태로든
is an
지금보다
U.S.
더 많이
alliance,
협력해야
so
한다고 생각하고
Korea needs to
협력할 수
collaborate
있다고
and cooperate
얘기해
more
왔습니다.
actively
이
with
후보는
Quad. That was Lee
인도가 할
Jae-myung's
수 있는
position.
협력을 한국이 할 수 없을 리 없다라는
And
입장을
if
취하고
India can
있습니다.
do it, Korea can do it. So
네, 제
that is the
말씀
basic
일단 여기서
position
마치겠습니다.
of Lee Jae-myung. Thank
감사합니다.
you.
네, 유정락
Thank you very much
위원장님
for your
아주
remarks.
전반적인 그런
Thank you for
방향과
sharing with
또
us
일부
the
중요한
overall
이제 이산화
direction
문제에
as
대해서까지도
well as
입장을
some
밝혀주셨는데,
important issues.
나중에 질문을 이제 드리겠습니다만
We will be addressing questions to you
이러한
later on.
이제 공약이 현재 정부와 비교해 볼 때
Well,
어느 정도 이제
the pledges
차이가
that you
나고 어느
have,
정도 개소성 선상에서 있는지
we would like to know how similar and different they are from the current administration.
국민의힘
We will now
윤석열 대선
go
후보
to
선대위에 외교안보 정책본부장을 맡고 계시는 김성환 전 외교차관 겸
Foreign Policy Advisor
거래대기
Kim
질문을
Sung-hwan
모시고
of the presidential
마찬가지로
campaign for Yoon Sung-yeol of the
윤석열
People
그
Power Party,
후보의
who is also a
전반적인
professor at the
외교안보
Graduate
정책과
School of International Studies at
필요하시다면
Korea
구체적인
University.
사안에 대해서 일부
So we would
말씀해
like to
주시면
listen
감사하겠습니다.
to your
네,
candidates'
감사합니다.
policies.
김성환입니다. 먼저 이렇게
Thank you very
귀중한 자리에
much.
불러주신
Thank you, first of all,
중앙일보
for this
또
great
CSIS에
invitation. Thank you to the
진심한 감사의
JoongAng
말씀을
Ilbo
드립니다.
as CSIS for this
전반적인
invitation.
윤석열 외교의
So if we take a look at the
슬로건이라고
overall
할까요?
foreign policy slogan of candidate Yoon,
브랜드는 역시 국익을
is
최우선하는
national interest. We are going to
정당한 외교,
prioritize
수순한
national
안보,
interest
또 요약이
on
될 수 있습니다.
firm
그런데 이
security.
세션 자체가
But this
미중
session
전략
is
경쟁
titled
속에서
Korea's Survival
한국의 대응을
Equation
논하는
in the
그런
Era
세션이기
of
때문에
U.S.-China Confrontation.
그 주제에
And so
한정시켜서
I would like to limit
윤석열
my
외교 또 입장 이것을
comments
좀 한 5가지
on
포인트
this
정도로
topic
간략하게
through
말씀을
5 points that I would like to make.
첫 번째는
First,
미중 양국의 상호 인식이
we have to take a look at the U.S.-China's perspective. It seems that their understanding of each other is becoming quite dangerous. If we take a look at recent surveys, the anti-U.S. and anti-Chinese sentiments are rising to the 70 to 75% level, or even above. And so it seems that there are negative sentiments on both sides, and these sentiments are quite heightened. And from a third person or nation perspective, like Korea, it is very concerning. The U.S. views China as a country that is trying to change the game, and China views the U.S. as hindering the China dream. And so they believe that U.S. is slowly declining. The second point that I would like to make is that we always talk about U.S.-China, but we also have to take a look at whether this is a competition over hegemony or is it strategic. I think we have to have an accurate understanding of this. That is the idea of the Yoon camp. Candidate Yoon also gives a lot of thought on whether this is a competition over hegemony or strategy, because he believes that such an understanding would be a great difference in the implications. As Ambassador Shin has mentioned, we do see that there is a large gap in power between the U.S. and China currently, and the U.S. power, some say, comes from its allies, which China does not have. And so for the U.S., they have very secure relations with their allies. As you're well aware, U.S. allies
얘기하고 있는 동맹국들은 현재로서는
There are
하나도
none of
없습니다.
them who say that they don't want to be an ally of the U.S. anymore. That really shows the power of the U.S.
And we can see that this power is founded on multilateral ties. And so we always talk about G2, but I think the only country that frequently uses this term is Korea, because the terminology of G2 actually makes us feel like we have to keep China and the US at an equal distance, but that really is not true. And so if we understand the competition to be a strategic competition, and we move away from the understanding that this is a competition over hegemony, rather that this is a strategic competition. We need to think of this as a strategic competition where China is contesting their rights in certain areas rather than confronting or challenging the U.S. So I think rather than challenging the U.S., they're contesting the U.S. The third point that I would like to make is along the similar lines. The U.S.-China relations not only is based on confrontations, but there's also cooperation and competition in the mixture. And I believe that that actually is a window of opportunity for Korea. If U.S. and China were solely in confrontation, then there would be no room for maneuver on the part of Korea other than our alliance with the U.S. But there is competition economically between the U.S. and China, and just like Ambassador Shin has mentioned, there's also cooperation for climate change and also non-proliferation as well as public health. And so for these areas, there is room for maneuver on the part of Korea to cooperate with both China and the U.S. So that brings me to my fourth point. Of course, we will be rooted in our U.S.-Korea alliance, but we will need to cooperate with China based on mutual respect. That really is the core of the foreign policies by candidate Yoon. It seems that the current administration is focused on North Korean policies, and so based on this perspective, they sometimes will move closer to the U.S. or sometimes to China. So they're putting both countries at an equal distance. And we also saw the joint statement by the two heads of states in May. And if we were to implement the statement, then we would have quite an ideal U.S.-Korea alliance. But will the current administration implement this within their term? And based on what they have done thus far, has what they have done thus far been melted into the joint statement? It seems that currently they are so focused on North Korean policies that we are actually losing our navigation in the U.S.-China confrontation era. The fifth point that I would like to make is that amidst the U.S.-China strategic competition, the most important, according to candidate Yoon, is the issue of economic security. So before this fierce competition between U.S. and China, we focused on efficiency and effectiveness according to economic theories. So we focused on price. That's why China became an all-important factory for the world. But the U.S. is talking about decoupling when it comes to China. Of course, it's not a full-out decoupling. In the areas of new technology, it seems that they are thinking about decoupling. And so for Korea, which is an ally to the U.S., we have to think about the very difficult equation that we have in our relations with China. And we should not approach this from just the efficacy issue, but we also have to have the security factor in the calculation. And so we have to have the perspective of economic security to reset our diplomatic policies. And so that is the homework on our hands. On September 22nd, we announced our pledges and we established a new security committee to discuss energy and resources in the environment within this framework. So we have pledged to create a system to discuss these issues. Recently at our camp, along with candidate Yoon, we believe that the Blue House should become the control tower for economic security by having a dedicated system. And so we are actually in the process of reviewing these ideas, and I believe that there will be an opportunity in the near future to present our ideas to the Korean public. And so we need to have an internal system that becomes the basis for economic security, and at the center of that should be the comprehensive strategic alliance with the U.S. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your remarks. So it seems that we have less than 20 minutes to go into our discussion. So we would like to ask you to take a deep dive into several questions. Well, Dr. Green has been with us throughout the session, and concerning the role of Korea, especially in the Indo-Pacific region and in the global domain, it seems that you believe that Korea needs to play a larger role in pluralism. We have Quad and AUKUS and other multilateral systems. The current government has not been active in those frameworks, but if we take a look at candidate Lee or candidate Yoon, as you have heard, they seem to be planning to become much more active in these teams. If Korea were to be interested in Quad or AUKUS, would the U.S. be willing to rapidly consider Korea's participation? We have also heard from another U.S. official that Korea's participation in Quad would not be considered. And so, despite the political difficulties in Korea, if we were to become more active on these multilateral systems, would the U.S. welcome this participation, or would you prefer to become more consolidated with the existing members? And also in your initial remarks, you mentioned that at the core of the U.S.-China competition is about the regional economics. That has been stated by other high-level officials of the U.S. And so would you focus on the regional economics in your competition, or would you expand that to military aspects or ideological aspects in this region?
Thank you very much. So I think the short answer to your first question, Minister Yoon, is that the United States would like to see more of Korea everywhere, that we are trying to reinforce a free and open Indo-Pacific. Everywhere we are trying to empower women in developing countries, trying to help nations like Vietnam or the Philippines improve their maritime capabilities. Everywhere we're developing rules for financing infrastructure to give countries an alternative to China's Belt and Road, one that might incentivize China to improve the transparency and the conditionality of Belt and Road. Everywhere we can get help in the Indo-Pacific from Korea, I think the Biden administration and the U.S. Congress would welcome it. as would Australia or India or Japan. And as I mentioned earlier, Korea is doing as much as any other democracy to try to reinforce rule of law, sustainable development. COICA is very active across Asia, for example, on development. But the difference between Korea and, say, Australia or Canada or Japan is that Korea is still trying to maintain something of an alibi, trying to avoid being somehow implicated. And I think that worked well for Korea for a while, but it's not effective foreign policy anymore. So the Quad is the US, Japan, Australia, India. I don't think that India in particular is looking for new members to be formal, to make it a quint, to make it a permanent 5-country or 6 or 8-country grouping, not for the near term, not for the foreseeable future. But I think the Korean option is very much what Canada or the UK or other countries are thinking. I would call it a la carte participation, showing the flag, bringing capabilities, joining in supply chain security discussions, sending ROC Navy frigates to the Malabar naval exercises, for example, joining with the US, Australia, Japan, and Europe on infrastructure financing cooperation. A more kind of a la carte, but showing the flag. And I think this is something that would be most welcome. AUKUS is a very specific agreement. Although the US, UK, and Australia will cooperate on supply chain security and other technology areas, the core of that agreement is the decision to help Australia build nuclear-powered submarines. Now, if the Korean Navy decided that nuclear-powered submarines are necessary and justified after a thorough national discussion, then that should be brought to the US, Australia, and the UK. But my guess is that a careful consideration of Korea's security environment would lead the Korean Navy to say that Korea's very capable diesel-powered submarines are the right choice. Australia is far away and needs long-range submarines that can protect the approaches to waters around Australia. When the Korean Navy leaves port, North Korea is right there. They don't have to go long distances. So the question would be, is that a good use of the budget? Because nuclear power is extremely expensive and complicated to sustain. Is that a better choice for Korea than destroyers, frigates, fighter jets, missiles? I mean, I think that would lead to a decision not to go for nuclear-powered submarines. But wherever it fits Korea's interests and wherever Korea can contribute, case by case, a la carte, I think there's an appetite definitely in Australia, in India, and even in Japan, and especially in the United States, to see more Korean flags on more efforts across the Indo-Pacific, bringing capacity and common values that everyone knows Korea has.
네, 그린 박사님, 감사합니다.
Thank you, Dr. Green, for your remarks. So we have talked about Quad or AUKUS, and it seems that the U.S. is also very much interested in the U.S., Korea, Japan security dialogue. As we have heard from Dr. Wee, it seems that the Lee administration would be much more interested in these dialogues. Maybe we can go to Dr. Shin, who has lived in Japan for a long time, to talk about the trilateral relations. How far should it be taken? And in relation to joining Quad, what would be the impact of the trilateral relations?
Thank you for the question. Before I address this question, I'd like to offer my comments, and I'd like to make some clarification regarding my initial remarks. So, when it comes to Korea's responses to the US-China strategic competition, the case-by-case approach, what I mean by that is that there are many complicated issues that are involved between Korea and the U.S. and Korea and China. So I think that we should not lump them together in addressing these very complicated and specific issues. And that is what I meant by the case-by-case approach. But I'd like to once again mention that we need to have an overall direction. So the overarching direction and framework has to be in place, and within that framework, we will have to approach issues on a case-by-case basis. And so I wanted to make some further clarification. And in order to reactivate the trilateral cooperation, we first need to improve our relations with Japan. Otherwise, this trilateral cooperation will not work successfully. So in this regard, as the U.S. is pushing for the Indo-Pacific strategy, I can say that there may be some smaller multilateral regimes, including Quad and AUKUS. But at the same time, the U.S. would like to improve this trilateral cooperation. But there are many pending issues that are holding back Korea-Japan ties. Currently, as Mr. Wee mentioned, whether we have a conservative party or a liberal party taking office, I like to emphasize the importance of normalizing and revitalizing our relations with Japan as quickly and as early as possible so that we can have stronger trilateral ties among the U.S., Korea, and Japan. Only then we can address the regional challenges more effectively because the security landscape in East Asia is becoming more complex, and we can almost assume that North Korea has such a strong nuclear capabilities, and China has been implementing very coercive foreign policies. So there is an increasing strategic challenge, and there's not a lot of predictability and transparency in the region. So in order to reduce strategic ambiguity in the region, the three countries, the U.S., Korea, and Japan, need to work together. And this will greatly contribute to peace and stability in the region. Therefore, I'd like to argue that the next government would have to improve its relations with Japan as in earnest. And so based on national consensus and bipartisan agreement between the ruling and the opposition parties, we need to pursue and improve our relations with Japan based on national support and national consensus. So concrete measures need to be taken. Thank you. Thank you for your initial remarks. And so basically, in order to improve the trilateral cooperation, we need to improve the bilateral relations between Korea and Japan, but we have two pending historical issues of comfort women and forced labor. And so far, Chairman Wee has been proposing various constructive ideas to address these historical issues, and I understand that your ideas have been reflected in President candidate Lee's camp. I wonder that is going to be the case. And of course, we need further domestic discussions, but what is your view on that? As I mentioned initially, if President Lee, if candidate Lee is elected, he will work on improving our relations with Japan as quickly as possible. Of course, we are working on the details right now, but what is fortunate is that based on my prior discussions with other participants on various occasions, I can see that there is not much disagreement. In other words, we have a lot of support both from the ruling and the opposition party for the need to improve our relations with Japan. So I think we have an overall consensus. So this is a very supportive environment, and we will be working on the specifics in terms of how we're going to improve the relations with Japan. So we're going to continue to do that, and if we exercise more flexibility, then there will be more support from Japan as well. So this is an overall approach.
뭐 구체적인 그런 이제 그 방안보다는
Well,
앞으로 이렇게
rather
수정된
than
노력을 기울이시겠다는
the
이제
detailed
말씀입니다.
efforts he
그
mentioned
지금
about the
그
overall
닥터린
direction,
박사님께서 말씀해 주신 내용 중에
we also have with us
앞으로
Dr. Lin.
3기 연임 이후
Well,
10년이
the 10 years after the third term of President Xi, you mentioned that it's very important.
저희가 보기에는
And in our view,
정부가 이제 계속 바뀌면서
the Chinese government has been changing, and the core interests of China and core areas of their interest have been expanding. Therefore, many East Asian countries and the US have been in some sort of confrontation with China. Now, given this strategic competition between the US and China, given the lack of much room for Korea to maneuver in this situation, and given that we have upcoming presidential election, there may be situations where vital interests of Korea and China may conflict. Then can we still maintain strategic ambiguity? Dr. Green said we don't have much room. So what is your view?
네, 윤석열 외교의 뭐 특징
Well,
중에
it
하나가
seems that
예측
candidate
가능한
Yoon's foreign policy is based on
내세우고 있습니다.
predictable foreign
이 전략적
policies. So that is the
모호성을
point.
완벽하게 배제할 수는
So we
없겠죠.
cannot completely
속에 있는
exclude
여러 가지
strategic
협상
ambiguity because
전략이라든지
it
이런
could be a
것들을
part of
드러내고,
negotiation strategies at
임하게 되면
times.
뭐 국익을 또
It would not
손상시키는
be
결과를 초래할 수
for our
있겠지만,
national interest if we
이 전략적 모호성이
do not
지나치다
have any
보면은
ambiguity. But
신뢰도가
if we
이제
have extreme
동맹
ambiguity,
관계에
then we can
있어서
lose trust and
이
confidence,
트러스트
especially
레벨이
in
속도로
alliance.
떨어지게 되면은
If we have a
자연스럽게
decreased level of mutual trust, then quite naturally,
전체의 신뢰도가
this could
떨어지는
impact the
그런
confidence of the
상황을
overall
초래하지
diplomacy.
않느냐라는 생각이 듭니다.
And so that could be
역시
one
미중
consideration that we
간에 그
make.
핵심적으로 충돌하는
If we take a look
사안은
at the core confrontations of the US and China, we can see it's mostly on policy and military, and recently in new technologies such as semiconductors and batteries, AI, and other fields of new technologies. And so from my perspective, concerning these areas, we need to first focus on our alliance. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, the US-Korea alliance is no longer simply a military alliance. It is a comprehensive strategic alliance for all areas, including new frontier areas. And so we go beyond just a military alliance. We have a strong partnership on all fronts. And so because we have a comprehensive alliance, we need to make sure that our foreign policies are more predictable in terms of our relations with China and also for North Korea. In our relations with China, we have to be clear on what we can do for China and what we cannot do for China. And at this point in time, I cannot draw the line for candidate Yoon, but being predictable means that we can prevent the dropping of confidence in each other that comes from excessive ambiguity. And that would be the foundation for candidate Yoon's foreign policies. We would need to find our strategic position within the US-China relations based on clear positioning and predictable foreign policies. Thank you very much. We are pressed for time, so we will go to our two US panelists for their comments on Taiwan. So this is a question that goes to our two US panelists. Well, we have seen that President Biden also talked about how we need a buffer to prevent collision, and we also talked about the need for our apparatus And so if we take a look at the Korean Peninsula, the South China Sea, and the area surrounding the Indo-Pacific region, there could be a possibility of military collision that we are focused on. If we take a look at SCMS, and in the May summit, we have reconfirmed that between the U.S. and Korea, we will be focusing on maintaining peace in the water surrounding Taiwan. So Dr. Green and Dr. Lin, from your perspective, do you believe that such a recognition between Korea and the U.S. is enough? Well, in the past, we talked about a strategic flexibility, and so concerning this issue, do you look forward to Korea playing a more active role, like Japan or Australia, related to military collision in the Indo-Pacific region, including Taiwan? So we would now like to listen to the two U.S. panelists.
Honey, after you.
Sorry, I think, Mike, did you say you wanted me to go first?
Please, on Taiwan.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Mr. Yun. I guess the first comment I would want to make on this is that I think what the Korea statement on Taiwan, I think it's a great first step in the right direction. I think right now, U.S. policymakers are quite aware of the complex situation and decisions that Korea faces with respect to Taiwan. So I don't think right now there is a great desire, for example, to ask Korea to play a significant role in terms of what the United States might need in thinking about U.S. military operations to come to Taiwan's defense in an event of a China-Taiwan contingency. But I think those are questions that the United States, should have in discussion with Korea when we look at this from a longer term perspective. I don't think, for example, politically we are at the stage where both sides, the United States and Korea, are ready to have those discussions now. But to say in 5 or 10 years, I think those are issues that we should put on our agenda, that the United States should be able to have those discussions in terms of what role Korea might play militarily on Taiwan.
So if I were in the White House and we had a contingency in Taiwan, I would look to Japan and perhaps Australia as the most important allies in terms of military operations. And I would be worried that in such a contingency, North Korea might be tempted to take some gamble or risk. And I would actually want the US ROK alliance focused like a laser on the DMZ and North Korea. So in terms of military operations, I think that, in fact, Korea's position is probably about right. And that if I were in the White House, I wouldn't ask Korea to do more on the Taiwan contingency right now because of the North Korea problem, which is very real. And Kim Jong-un might be tempted, if there's a crisis in Taiwan Strait, to do something. So deterrence on the Korean Peninsula is the first and second and third most important mission of the US-Korea alliance. And that's where I would keep the focus. However, I thought that President Moon's statement with President Biden was very important for this reason. Chinese use of military coercion anywhere in Asia is bad for Korea, and it's very bad for the United States. And from that perspective, President Moon's statement and any other further demonstration of solidarity among democracies is very useful to cause China to hesitate, to pause, to think that if China uses military force against Taiwan or any country, all the democratic nations might. We can have strategic ambiguity about exactly what would happen, but all the democratic nations in the world might come together to impose a significant geopolitical and economic cost on China for its military coercion against a smaller party. And in many, many discussions about the China issue, I'm reassured by the strong commitment that I've heard from both my friends Lee Sung-ok and Kim Sung-an to the alliance. But the discussion is about the US-China confrontation as the problem. And that is a problem for Korea. US-China confrontation is a problem for Korea. But isn't there another problem, which is the precedent for that, which is Chinese coercion against Korea and THAAD, against India and Himalayas, against Australia with a boycott, against the people of Hong Kong? There is no doubt, almost, I think every China expert would agree, we are seeing a much higher level of coercion and pressure against other smaller surrounding states and medium-sized states, and even larger states like Canada and Korea by China. That's a problem. So the China strategy that Korea needs, in my view, is one that thinks, how do we not only manage US-China strategic competition, but how do we help shape Chinese decisions so there's less coercion, so that China takes a different path? That shaping of Chinese strategy and Chinese choices is something Korea can contribute to, but to be honest, it's not part of the discussion right now. Most of the discussion is how do we stay out of the US-China strategic competition, which is very passive, understandable given Korea's position, but only focuses on one of the problems. The other problem is China's behavior. And I think for the US-Korea alliance in the next administration, we need a discussion about that. How can we shape China's behavior? What can Korea bring to that effort? And I think if Korea is in that discussion, the US will listen to Korea quite a bit about our own approach to China. And that will give Korea more leverage to shape US-China strategic competition and confrontation as well.
네, 그린 박사님 그리고 린 박사님.
Thank you, Dr. Green and Dr. Lin, for your remarks. And we would like to thank our three Korean panelists for their remarks as well. I do have many more questions that I would like to ask, but we are behind schedule. And so this brings us to the end of session 1. Thank you very much.
수고하셨습니다.
수고하셨습니다.
네, 중앙일보 CSIS
Thank you
Forum
very much.
2021
This has been session 1 of the JoongAng CSIS Forum 2021 on the topic of Korea's survival equation in the era of US-China confrontation. I'd like to thank the moderator and our panel members. We will have a 5-minute break, and then session 2 will begin. Thank you.
(2022) 우리의 선택, 뉴스룸이 가장 앞에 서겠습니다.
매일매일 더 다채로운 대선 뉴스로 시청자들을 찾아갑니다. 대선은 JTBC.
2022 우리의 선택, 뉴스룸이 가장 앞에 서겠습니다. 매일매일 더 다채로운 대선 뉴스로 시청자들을 찾아갑니다. 대선은 JTBC.
널 처음 만났을 때가 생각나. 내가 만약 평범한 젊은이였다면 내가 종이 비행기를 줍지 않았더라면 애초에 널 만나지 않았더라면
내가 누군지 모르지.
헤어에는 컬이 있어야 한다.
라디오에는 안테나가 있어야 한다.
나비에게는 날개가 있어야 한다.
연애에는 밀당이 있어야 한다.
음악에는 울림이 있어야 한다.
노래에는 절제가 있어야 한다.
Dr. Cha and Dr. Katz, we're going to be
무대는 여유가 있어야 한다.
성공에는
실패가 있어야 한다.
실패에는
다시가 있어야 한다.
다시
다시
나를 부르다.
시우게임
2.
녹색과 귤색과 분홍색 다채로운 질감 아마 난 너를 좋아하나 봐 기쁨과 슬픔도 고맙고 아름다운 순간들 아마 난 너를 사랑하나 봐 JTBC
네, 지금부터 중앙일보 CSIS 포럼
We would
2021
now
두
like to
번째
begin
세션
session 2 on
한반도
the topic of the road to Korean
이번
Peninsula
세션에 답장을
denuclearization
맡아주신
and peace.
송민순 전
Let me
외교통상부
invite
장관께
moderator
마이크
Song Min-sun,
넘기겠습니다.
former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
예, 저번 첫 번째 세션에서 아주
Thank you.
한반도
In the first
한국의
session, we
생존
discussed Korea's survival equation in the era of U.S.-China confrontation, and the panel discussion was very fruitful.
방향 이 문제를 논의할 때
When we discuss Korea's survival equation, we often talk about this topic in the context of the U.S.-China confrontation. However,
북한 핵 문제
we also need to address the North Korean nuclear issue, which is critical for Korea's survival.
바로 따라서 이 미중 사이에서
Therefore,
한국이
as Korea is
유지될 수 있는
situated between the
운신의
U.S. and China,
그런
we
룰이
also need to
만들어지고
address
있는
the
게
nuclear issue of North Korea, which
오늘
adds more
이 문제에
complexity to the current
식견 있고
situation.
경험을 갖고 있는
Therefore, in our session, we have invited
한국과 미국의
experts from both Korea and the U.S. who have extensive understanding and knowledge about the Korean Peninsula issues. I look forward to our panel discussion.
그 사실 이제 2019년 2월 그 하노이
In February
회담이
2019, there was a breakdown of the negotiations in Hanoi, and ever since then, the North Korean nuclear issue has been in a limbo and a lot of stalemate. And because of the pandemic, on top of the current situation, deadlock, we have this current situation on the Korean Peninsula that needs to be addressed when the new president takes office next year. It is not easy to predict what's happening in the DPRK.
그래서 지금 이렇게 보면은 우선 하노이 회담 이후에
Now,
미국과
after the Hanoi talks, the U.S. and the DPRK have been maintaining their existing
핵보유국의
positions.
이 지위에서 미국과
And
협상하겠다고
North Korea
이렇게
seems to
주장을 하고 있고
argue
북한은
that it has
미국으로서는
to be dealt
그런
with
입장을
as a
받아들이기
nuclear
어렵다, 이런 걸로
state,
보입니다.
and the U.S. refuses to accept North Korea as a nuclear state.
우선 제가 미국에서
Therefore,
참석 중인
in our session,
닥터 차
I would first like to invite Dr. Cha.
북한이 핵 국가의 지위를 유지하면서
Now, the DPRK wishes to present itself as a nuclear state in its negotiations with the U.S. And what does the U.S. think about this? And if we have continuation of this deadlock on the Korean Peninsula with respect to the nuclear issue, this may lead to a further potential proliferation of nuclear arsenals in the region, and this may add more security challenges in the region. So now, my second question is, what is the priority of nuclear issues to the Biden administration, and what is the position of President Biden when it comes to potential negotiations with the DPRK? So can you share your view? So we have a lot of topics to cover. So when you present your remarks, I'd like to limit your individual remarks to 2 minutes each so that we can have more rounds of discussions in the session. So this is something that I would also like to remind the other panel members. So for all of your remarks, please limit them to 2 minutes, and then we will have more rounds as we go on with our discussion. So, Dr. Cha, would you go first, and then if necessary, maybe Dr. Katz can jump in after Dr. Cha to add more comments about the U.S. position. So, Dr. Cha, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, former Mr. Song. It's first, let me just say we're very gratified to co-host the JCSIS Forum again in 2021. And even though we're doing it online and our CSIS delegation cannot be with you in Seoul, we're still happy to see everyone online for this event. And I'm particularly happy to see former Mr. Song as well as other members of the panel who we worked together on six-party talks, which is really the last agreement that we've had on North Korea's nuclear weapons programs. So in respect to the chairman's mandate, I'm going to keep my remarks very short, try to directly answer his questions. First, in terms of the Biden administration's policy and the priority, I think they place a high priority on this issue. I mean, this is one of the foremost threats and challenges to U.S. security in Northeast Asia, and it goes more broadly than Northeast Asia. So I think it remains a very high priority for the administration. Having said that, they have stated a fairly ambiguous policy of saying that they're willing to try a pragmatic and calibrated approach and willing to meet with North Korea anytime and any place. I think the reason that it sounds a bit ambiguous is that it demonstrates a willingness to re-engage in a denuclearization negotiation, ones as complex and as protracted as the ones that you yourself undertook, former Mr. Song, when we did the first agreement in 2005. But I also think it sounds a bit ambiguous without specific proposals because there's a heavy degree of skepticism in the Biden administration and more broadly in Washington, D.C., about the seriousness with which North Korea takes denuclearization negotiations. There does not appear to be any interest on the part of North Korea. And when some in South Korea say that North Korea has been quiet, and I use the term quiet in quotation marks, because it hasn't done long-range ballistic missile tests or nuclear tests, that's very far from the truth because North Korea continues to operate the 5-megawatt reactor at Yongbyon. It continues to irradiate nuclear fuel rods that can then be reprocessed for producing more fissile material for nuclear weapons. We watch all of these facilities at CSIS through our commercial satellite imagery, and the nuclear program and the missile program and the submarine program are going at an all-out pace. So the notion that they've been quiet and that is somehow a sense of peaceful intention is hard for those who follow these things to really take as a serious proposition. So let me just stop there and turn it back to the chair.
예,
So from the U.S. position, he expressed his understanding. Now, back to Korea, we have some conflicting views about North Korea and their intention with respect to nuclear issues. For instance, today in the media, it was reported that the head of the National Intelligence Service mentioned that there was the halt of nuclear tests, but there was no reward given to the DPRK for their suspension of nuclear tests. That was reported in the media, and it was said by the head of the National Intelligence Service. So now I'd like to invite Professor Kim, Ambassador
윤석열 후보가 아니고
Wi Song-nak. Ambassador Wi Song-nak.
이재명.
No, I'm working for Lee Jae-myung. Oh, I'm sorry for the confusion. So
이재명 후보의
Ambassador Wi Song-nak is now serving as Chief Foreign Policy Advisor for Lee Jae-myung. So I'd like to hear from you.
북한이 핵실험을 중지하고 있는 상태에서 미국이나 한국이나
North Korea has stopped nuclear tests. And what do you believe should be the compensation from South Korea and the U.S.? Is the perspective that we need to compensate for them? Do you believe it is appropriate? Well, do you believe that North Korea becoming a de facto nuclear state is a breach of existing treaties? And so do we need to compensate for them? Even though they have already breached their promises, what is your position? Well, I am the Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung. Well, I'm focused on having policy suggestions and recommendations. So I don't think I am in the position to comment on the current administration. But in principle, we went through Singapore and Hanoi, and China has mentioned that this is a double halt because actions have stopped on both sides. That's from 2018 to 2019. And now it's becoming a little bit ambiguous. And so that's why the controversy remains. And so I will not be answering the question that you presented to me, but I would like to mention that historically there was the double halt. And currently, that is controversial because North Korea does not interpret it in this way, and we interpret it in another way. So I think there is a difference in interpretation. But if we take a look at presidential candidate Lee, his thought is that the root of the nuclear program is very complicated because they have the security dilemma, there's the lack of trust, and they also use it as a means of threat, and they're using it also as a bargaining chip. And so it's a very complicated route that led to the nuclear program. And so the response also must be complex. There's no simple solution. And so therefore, we need discussions and negotiations, but we also need incentives and disincentives, and we also need sanctions and compensation. So, because it's a complex issue, we have to respond with a complex solution. And secondly, we will be flexible in our negotiations, but if there is a break of promise or if North Korea misbehaves, we need to clearly point that out and respond to the wrongdoings. Those are the two pillars that candidate Lee has in responding to North Korea. So
이 김성환 차관 이야기를 듣기 전에 한 가지
before we turn
지금
to
이제 그
Advisor Kim Sung-han for presidential
후보는
candidate Yoon,
이
I would like to
북한의
continue
그
to ask about candidate Lee.
비핵화에 앞서서 이걸
So before
끌어내기 위해서
denuclearization, so in order to have denuclearization, does candidate Lee believe that we should lift sanctions before denuclearization? And if North Korea does not keep its promise to denuclearize, should we snap back to sanctions? I think I've seen reportings of this position by candidate Lee. First of all, is this the correct position of candidate Lee? Yes, that is the position of candidate Lee. But I think there's an overemphasis on a single point. This is one of the North Korean policies by candidate Lee. So I gave you the macro picture. What you mentioned is one part of that. So you mentioned that it's one of the policies. So if we lift the sanctions and if North Korea does not denuclearize and then we snap back to sanctions, well then if we do that, then we would need even stronger sanctions in order for this formula to work. If we were to lift sanctions first and then wait for denuclearization, if there is no denuclearization, we would snap back to even stronger sanctions. Would such a mechanism be possible? Well, it depends on how we design the process and what kind of breaches there were. And we can also take a look at the response of the U.S., the international community, and also the UN Security Council. So we cannot talk about whether such a mechanism would be possible or not, because it would depend on the action of North Korea and the response of the international community. Well, we would leave it at that for this point in time.
Next, I'd like to invite Chief Foreign Policy Advisor Kim Sung-han. I'm sorry that I was mixing you two up between these two candidates, and I would love to see some more integrated approaches. Of course, I understood what you meant, and I think I need to make some comments. The statement by Park Ji-won, head of the National Intelligence Service, that you referred to in your opening remarks, there was no ICBM launches and there was no nuclear test and there should be some reward. I don't think that was the intention of this statement, but rather I think what he meant by saying this was that before any process begins, we have to remember that the DPRK does not need to have nuclear arsenal if there's no need, there's no threat to its regime, and if there's no military confrontation or possibilities of such military confrontation. So there was this virtuous cycle that Mr. Park was referring to, and so there was the blow-up of Punggye-ri facility, but there was no reward from the U.S., and I think that's what President Park of NIS mentioned. Yes, there are no long-range missile launches. That is one action taken by the DPRK, and he was saying that there should be some corresponding reward or compensation from the U.S. or Korea. But we need to go back further into the past. The DPRK has already developed its nuclear program, so they still have the nuclear arsenal. But just because the DPRK suspended nuclear tests, I don't think it is qualified for any reward because there's this lack of balance between carrots and sticks. Well, that balance, I think that it is actually about the motivation behind the nuclear program. And so when it comes to our effort to build a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, there was some initial processes, but the Hanoi talks failed. So we need to find a new momentum, new breakthrough, and I think that was what was mentioned by that.
Well, I would like to add to that. So Ambassador Kim,
유승락 대사와 고유한 교수가 말씀하신 것
concerning the statement by Professor Ko and Ambassador
질문을
Wee,
하고 싶은 것은
I have a question for you.
윤석열 후보 측에서는
So
이게
candidate
이제
Yoon
선비핵화가 안 되면은
is
앞으로 나아가기
in the position that if there's denuclearization first, it's difficult to advance from there.
우리 보통 하면 이제 선 이후난이라고
So
쉬운 것부터 해서
we
어려운 걸로
always
나가야
talk
된다.
about how we
그거 가지고는 안
need to
되니까
pick the low-hanging fruits
전체적으로
first, but
빅딜 같은 거, 좀 큰 거 합의를 하고
with North Korea,
나가야
it
된다
should
하는
be a
그런
big deal
기조가
approach
깔려 있는
where
것으로
we have
제가 이해를
denuclearization
하고
first.
있는데
I think that is the
그런 방식은
overall
지금까지
direction of candidate Yoon.
방식으로서는 지금까지 이게
That's
진전이
to
안
the best
된
of my
거예요.
understanding. But this
원칙은
method has not
좋습니다만
worked thus far. So the principle
원칙은
is good,
좋지만은 그게
but
현실적으로
it
가기
hasn't
어려운데
worked
그리
thus
되면은
far.
현재 한반도에서의 대치
So if
운명이나
we maintain this position, then we will continue to have confrontations on the Korean Peninsula with North Korea continuing to develop their nuclear program. Well, are you taking this into consideration? Well, before I go into that,
북한이 그 핵실험을 하지 않고
so North Korea has suspended nuclear tests, and should there be a compensation for this? Well, they're doing something they should not. They're not. It's difficult to say that we need to compensate them to do something they should already be doing. So because of UN Security Council resolutions, they cannot launch missiles or test nuclear programs. And so they're doing something that they have to do. So we cannot compensate them for that. During the last 3 decades, we only experienced that North Korea continued to develop its nuclear program. So we need to maintain firm sanctions, and we need to look to North Korea to see if they actually take practical steps towards denuclearization. So it's not a big deal approach. A big deal approach would mean a package deal. So if I give you this much, then you need to give up your nuclear weapons in a verifiable way. That's a big deal. Candidate Yoon's position is not a small deal person or a big deal person, but if we need to call it something, it's a middle deal. So we will not be making extreme choices in our North Korean policies, but will we just sit and wait until North Korea denuclearizes itself? No, we will engage North Korea in dialogue, and if they show us that they are willing to move in the direction of denuclearization, we can provide humanitarian aid or economic cooperation. So we could be flexible in our position. And so candidate Yoon's position is very far from the so-called big deal approach. Additionally, whether it be a big deal or a medium deal, so you are waiting to see actual acts of denuclearization before lifting of sanctions, correct? Yes, that is correct. But from North Korea's perspective, they are saying they have no more to do. They have no more that they can do, because they're not conducting nuclear tests, they're not testing long-range missiles. And so North Korea is saying that the ball is in your court. And so concerning this, what is the position of candidate Yoon? If we take on a slightly critical perspective, then we can say that the international community, along with the U.S., continues to have sanctions on North Korea, and we are saying that North Korea has to live with these sanctions if they do not behave. A few days ago, in the U.S., there were similar discussions. If the U.S.-China relations is good, and even if the inter-Korean relations is going well, then Even at those times, sometimes China does not implement the UN Security Council resolutions and the sanctions that follow those resolutions. And so, if we do not have China on board, then pressure through sanctions have never worked thus far. And so, we know that this hasn't worked thus far, but candidate Yoon continues to believe that we should use sanctions until there are practical denuclearization measures taken by North Korea. Will that mechanism work? If not, the status quo will continue. Well, you talked about how sanctions didn't work in the past, but I cannot agree with that statement. Because before 2017, the sanctions were not actual sanctions. But ever since 2017, the UN Security Council resolutions and the subsequent sanctions were quite painful sanctions to North Korea. And so the effect of these sanctions, we are not sure how long it will take for those effects to kick in, but we believe that these sanctions are strategically meaningful. And the sanctions against North Korea, well, some say that they have not been effective, and so relying on sanctions will not lead us ultimately to denuclearization. And I think that type of approach is far from our reality. Well, so everyone has different methods that we are discussing.
So these sanctions are maybe the only viable options for the international community, but there are many controversies over the effectiveness of these sanctions on the DPRK. Let's say that the DPRK is an island, then the situation may be different, but North Korea is bordered with China. And there's more than 1,500 kilometers of border stretching between China and North Korea. There are many holes along this border where some flows are going back and forth between China and the DPRK. So some people are suspicious about the effectiveness of the sanctions. So I'd like to invite Dr. Katz on this.
Thank you, Foreign Minister Song, and I want to, also echo other panelists in saying what an honor it is to be here this morning in Korea, this evening in the United States at this very consequential time in the South Korean campaign. So I think I will kind of follow up on some of the remarks Dr. Cha started with, and then respond more directly to the question on sanctions. In thinking about what the U.S. is thinking, there has been a lot of mention of the policy being quite vague at this time, and I think there are a lot of good reasons for that. But I did want to just to kind of list a few things that I think we do know about that policy. A lot of which are consistent with the parameters that we had said in the CSIS Commission report that Dr. Hamre had mentioned earlier. Purely by coincidence, of course, but just wanted to note these things. First, denuclearization remains the goal for the United States. That even if that is seen as not realistic in the near term, that it should remain the goal. In the meantime, can work on managing the threat and this is where all these questions come into play, the difficult questions. Allies are to be consulted and have been consulted very closely by the Biden administration, and that is a marked change from the prior 4 years. And so I think we can at least point to these things as being very important components of the U.S. policy. That said, as Dr. Cha mentioned, as others have mentioned, North Korea has not expressed interest in coming to the table. And so I think this conversation really reflects the importance of thinking about and planning for deadlock. And having a blueprint and some kind of backup plan for deadlock. Something we've experienced several times as all of the experienced folks here know very well. And so thinking about that deadlock, I'll echo some of Dr. Green's comments earlier. I think this is a real space of opportunity, honestly, to shape the choices of North Korea, to increase the costs of bad behavior, and also to shape the choices of China. And so this is where the China foreign policy kind of initiatives kind of can dovetail with North Korea policy. So I'll suggest a few things. Nothing's new here, of course. There's really not much new under the sun on North Korea. So I'm not saying anything groundbreaking here, but things to really think about and to double down on as we think about how to respond to things North Korea does. Upholding deterrence. U.S. and South Korea taking every opportunity to reaffirm the treaty-bound commitment to defend South Korea. Joint military exercises being a very important part of that. For the United States, that means reinforcing our commitment to extended deterrence at the highest levels, as President Biden has done in the statement in May and at other high-level meetings, to use its full range of capabilities. This is a reassurance that has been historically important for the United States to repeat time and time again. And in terms of increasing U.S. ROK Japan trilateral cooperation is another critical element of this. And high-level meetings that have been going on. Of course, this is a very sensitive area. We'll continue to have the difficulties that it's had in the past. But to think about even new areas to cooperate with Japan, it does affect, as the earlier panel noted, it does affect the space that North Korea sees and the choices it perceives. As far as sanctions go, that is a part of a kind of pressure strategy for deadlock. But I think these other things should also be in play in terms of thinking about how to pressure North Korea, short of war, right? Short of much more the stuff we don't want to see again. I think I can speak collectively for that we've seen in recent years. Of course, inducements are important as well. And that should remain something, inducements as a strategy for a deadlock. But I think it's also very important to think about not giving something for nothing and to not trade critical alliance equities when the North Korean threat remains unchanged and increasing.
Yeah.
So I'll close with that, but I think that it's just kind of something that maybe frames some of the earlier comments. Thank you
very much. 근데 지금 이게 쭉 이야기 들은 보면은 사실은
if we listen to the overall dialogue, it seems that if we go on, it means that we're going to maintain the status quo with conflict and tension. And so related to this, we will go to the Chief Foreign Policy Officer Kim Sung-wan for candidate Yoon.
Currently, the U.S. is providing extended deterrence to Korea. It is rather sometimes called a nuclear umbrella that's provided by the UK's. How strong do you think this deterrence is and how effective it is? Because do you think that it is reliable and it is strong enough for Korea to trust? From presidential candidate Yoon's perspective, we believe that the U.S. extended deterrence is very firm and very strong. Some seem to have expressed distrust over this extended deterrence, and some are even talking about having nuclear power ourselves for self-defense. However, in our position, at our camp, we believe that the extended deterrence is sufficient. You can think of this in terms of actual capability and also the confidence level. As for nuclear defense capabilities, the U.S. has sufficient capabilities, but when it comes to confidence issues, the ICBMs by North Korea have almost been completed according to some suggestions and research. So then, in case of any contingency on the Korean Peninsula, when the DPRK threats the mainland U.S., then would the U.S. actually be able to use this nuclear umbrella and extended deterrence in reality? So there may be some controversies over this question, but
사용할 수 있을지,
and the question is whether the U.S. is willing to use nuclear deterrence in such a case, and whether what the DPRK's response is going to be. And I believe that there is both sufficiency in terms of capability and confidence. What do you think, Mr. Wee?
저희도 확장 억지를 중심으로
centered around the extended deterrence, we need to respond to the nuclear issue. And the extended deterrence, I believe, is functioning. But if we take a look at the security reality of Korea, it's always volatile. And we cannot say that the U.S. deterrence is fixed. And so they are reviewing their concepts and functions of the nuclear umbrella. So that is not something that is remaining in concrete form. And so we need to continue our dialogue and negotiations. We should not just stand still, but we need to continue to talk so that we can maintain functional deterrence. And so we believe that we need a stronger mechanism for our mutual deterrence agreement. And so for that, we could take a look at various options, such as sharing of information or weaponry or participation of Korea and various ways. Then we will go to Dr. Cha.
Now we've been talking about extended deterrence of the U.S. And as Ambassador Wee mentioned, the U.S. is providing such deterrence, but even some allies are questioning the reliability and effectiveness of such deterrence. And so there are some also controversies over potential actions in case of contingency. So given these discussions in Korea, some say that even though Korea is under the nuclear umbrella provided by the U.S., that may not be enough. So nuclear fuel cycle, in maybe the initial stage of the nuclear fuel cycle, should be allowed for Korea, because we need to be prepared for the future, and this may provide a starting point for a potential nuclear state in the future if there's any reason for that. So from the U.S. perspective, there has been a lot of talks about nuclear recycling capability and nuclear fuel reprocessing. So what is the U.S. position regarding this potential possibility in Korea?
I have to be very frank. Sometimes I find these conversations about the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence coming from South Korea a bit confusing and almost binary, in the sense that on the one hand, there's a conversation in Korea about whether the United States should provide a peace declaration, an end of war declaration to North Korea, for which the North Korean response is effectively, we're only interested if the United States removes its troops, stops joint military exercises, and ends its nuclear umbrella. And then it moves to a conversation of, well, will the United States then provide a nuclear umbrella to South Korea? And is that nuclear umbrella still credible? These conversations are very much at odds with one another. And I think for many in Washington, they find it a bit confusing. Because on the one hand, an end of war declaration, if the North Koreans are going to seriously consider it, would have to start moving into discussions of joint military exercises and nuclear umbrella. And on the other hand, there's also this conversation about what can the United States do to enhance, make stronger its extended nuclear deterrence, when that would be completely at odds with an end of war declaration, given North Korea's demands for what comes with an end of war declaration. With regard to nuclear fuel cycles and recycling, the United States, as you know well, the United States and South Korea have recently renegotiated their civil nuclear uses of energy agreement. I don't think that there should be changes to that agreement. recycling or reprocessing is not something that is a part of that agreement. And the notion that countries should start to amass fissile material as a part of some sort of guarantee or sign of credibility of the nuclear umbrella, to me, doesn't really make a lot of sense. I would also like to add that the concerns about from the North Korean perspective, the current concerns about the United States and the threat the United States poses. The United States only poses one threat to North Korea, and that is if North Korea ever broke the peace. If it ever broke the peace, then the United States would be a threat to North Korea. But if the peace is not broken, the United States has stated on numerous occasions, including in the 2005 joint statement that Foreign Minister Song knows well because he was the South Korean chief negotiator, the United States has already stated clearly on paper that it will not attack North Korea with nuclear or conventional weapons. Now, that's about the most clearest sign of non-hostile intent that the United States can provide. North Korea may say that's just a piece of paper, that's just words on a piece of paper. But that's no different from an end of war declaration. That's just end of war declaration is just words on a piece of paper. So the notion that either one of those is going to be successful at bringing North Korea back to the negotiation table is a spurious argument, in my opinion.
Yeah. Dr. Cha가 자연스럽게 이게 종전선언
Dr. Cha
문제로
mentioned
이야기가
the end of war
진행되었는데
declaration, and so we are moving our dialogue in that direction.
고유한 박사
So let us turn to Dr. Go Yu-hwan.
국책연구원에서 일을 하고 계시니까
He is a part of a national research institute.
종전선언이라는 게 지금 정부에서 생각하는 게 내용 종전선언의 첫 번째 들어가는 게 전쟁이 한반도의 전쟁이 끝났다.
That there is an end of war on the Korean Peninsula. So is it a statement saying that the war is over, or is it a statement that the war will be over? Which way is that? Which is the direction that you are thinking about? This is a statement to end the war.
네, 그러니까 지금 한국 전쟁이
So the Korean War,
71년 동안
for the
지속되는
last
비정상적인
71 years,
형태로
has
정전
technically
질서가
been
계속 유지되고
ongoing,
있고 그래서
and
이
so
짧은
that is an
전쟁의
abnormal
경우는 그 전쟁이 끝난
situation.
직후에 평화협정을 맺으면서 대체로
Most
그
wars
일항의
would
종전선언이
end
들어가는
the
거죠.
war and have a peace treaty following that. But the Korean War has been a very long war.
이제 이
And
평화
so,
프로세스와
in
비핵화
order to
프로세스를
start the
연계하는
peace process
입구에서
and in connecting that with the denuclearization process,
그 촉매로서
we would be
종전선언을
using
제안한
the
거죠.
end of war statement to trigger this process.
대사도 그렇게 생각하세요?
Dr. Cha, do you agree with this position?
선언인가요? 아니면
Dr. Wee, do you agree with this? Is it a statement to end the war? Is it a statement to say that the war is over? Well, I'm not aware of the details. I know that discussions are ongoing with the U.S., but this is my thought on the end of war declaration. So we have negotiated with North Korea for decades, and we now all know that in order to move denuclearization forward, we cannot work on denuclearization and the economy alone. So those two are not enough to achieve denuclearization. So we need to have peace, confidence building, and guarantee of the regime in order to move forward. And so that is why we have various ideas, and one of which is the end of war statement. So it is one idea for the peace and security track, but we need to be very careful. How are we going to manage these two tracks? How do we make sure that there's a synergy effect between the two tracks? But if there's no synergy effect, then it would become very difficult. So my point of interest is the connection between these two tracks. So candidate Lee talked about a complex resolution, and that's one of that. Well, many people can relate to why we need to end the war on the Korean Peninsula. But when we say we want to have an end of war statement, we have to think about the wording that goes into the statement. So we had a ceasefire in 1953. 1953 and the war ended on such and such date. Is that the statement? Or is it a statement to end the war? Well, having heard the two people that made this statement, it means that it is a statement to end the war, but we have had other statements like that. The Geneva negotiations and other negotiations have led to statements to end the war, and some of us participated in those negotiations. And so do we need to repeat that? And so if we're talking about an end of war statement, we need to be able to say that the war is over. And I think it's meaningless if we state that the war will be over. And so it's actually more focused on making a statement than an end of war statement. Maybe we can go to Ambassador Kim from the Yun camp.
그렇죠. 지금 최대의 우리 목표는 북한 비핵화 아닙니까? 근데 지금 북한의
Our ultimate goal is
지금
denuclearization of North Korea.
뭐 근처에도 못 간.
And
속된 말로 그런
we are
상황인데
not even
거기서 지금
closer to that end goal. And if we just declare end of war, when we did not make any progress in terms of denuclearization,
뭐 조건에 관해서 선언을
we
한다.
may
과연
come up with
이게
some
어느
sort of
정도까지
declaration
북한
that may
비핵화에
include some
도움을 줄수
conditions for the
있을지
end of war. I wonder if this will have any
의구심을
impact on the denuclearization process. We are quite doubtful
종전선언은
about
잘
that.
아시다시피
As you may
전쟁이
know,
끝났다.
an end of war
송
declaration,
장관님 말씀하신 대로 war is over.
as
그리고
Minister
평화선언의
Song
대개 서두에
said, supposed to be saying that the war is over. And
떼어낼 경우에
if we do not declare that,
해야 된다는 것이죠.
then we may not have an effective declaration. And if we want to end the war on the Korean Peninsula, then we need to be more effective in drafting this statement because there's so much desire for end of war by the Korean people. But in order to end the war, we need North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, and denuclearization has to happen. We need to think about which has to come first, whether end of the war declaration should come first or denuclearization should come first. I don't think the former is necessarily true because candidate Lee is saying that end of war declaration would lead to denuclearization, but 38% of the respondents in a recent survey say that denuclearization efforts have to come first. But of course, a survey may be designed in certain ways. But what I want to say about the position of candidate Yoon, candidate Yoon is saying that there's no national consensus or agreement on the end of war declaration. And then you're saying that denuclearization has to take place first before an end of war declaration. And it really means that announcing an end of war declaration is so significant that we have to be careful and cautious. So combining these two different positions, I can say that we have the denuclearization process and the peace process, and they have to be aligned more effectively, right? I think the both camps are basically on the same page when it comes to the ultimate goal. And of course, they have some different ideas about the means and the measures we can utilize to achieve the end goal. So for candidate Yoon, denuclearization has to make some more progress, while candidate Lee is saying that end of war declaration can facilitate denuclearization. So there's this slight difference in their positions and views. End of war declaration if it is just saying that we are declaring our intention to end the war, that's something that may not carry much weight.
그러니까 국민적 합의가 이루어질 수가 없는 거죠.
And I don't think there is any possibility for a national consensus on this part or end of war declaration because there's no substance when we are just going to say we wish to end the war. Now, for candidate Yoon, he seems to be focusing more on how to facilitate and restart the denuclearization process. Now, I'd like to invite the American panel members. Wait a second. So, you mentioned Lee Jae-myung, so please give me some time to clarify on our positions.
Well, I don't know if our thoughts are the same as the thoughts of the current government, but we need the peace track as a synergy to the denuclearization track. And so I don't think we should be negative on the end of war declaration. The important thing is how we do it. And one way is the wording, how we express this. And I mentioned that I'm not sure about the wording, but what we need to make sure is that there could be dozens of ways of expressing the end of war. It could be different expressions and wordings. But we need to have appropriate caveats so that we have a synergy effect between the two tracks. That is the thoughts of our camp. Well, I would like to add to that as well. Well, the end of war declaration was mentioned as a response to the September agreement to close down their Yangbang facility. So it was inside the process, but when there was a no deal in Hanoi, the discussions on the end of war statement ended as well. So when we think about the effects of sanctions, North Korea said that you need to lift 5 sanctions for these two conditions, and that's why Hanoi became a no deal. And so I believe that end of war declaration is one card to break through this standstill. Well, we have had various negotiations. For example, the 4-party talks in Geneva was also to end the war. And the 6-party talks on September 11th of 2005 also talked about a permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So if we were to further discuss this issue, then we would need to actually have a concrete content for the statement. So if we do not have concrete contents that we can discuss, we will just fall into discussions. So before we go into the next topic, let's go to a yes or no question to Dr. Cha. So on the Korean Peninsula, if we were to declare that the war has ended, then what about the USFK and the UN command on the Korean Peninsula? What would be the U.S. perspective on the impact of the declaration on USFK and UN command? Just a brief comment, please.
Okay, that question can't be answered yes or no. But I will say, I mean, this goes back to your earlier question, Foreign Minister, about the credibility of deterrence. If there were somehow a dismantlement of UNC or USFK as a result of an end of war declaration, without any real changes on the ground in terms of North Korean conventional or nuclear threats, that would be a very bad situation for when we're talking about credibility of the U.S. security guarantee. So I don't think if there is an end of war declaration, there should be no tie between that and the status of U.S. forces Korea or UN command. If anything, that command and exercises associated with the alliance would have to be heightened in order to show that deterrence is still quite strong on the peninsula.
제가 이 문제에 관련해서 이
So
협상의
concerning this
당사자에
topic,
관해서 한 가지 좀 의견을 듣고
I would like to
지금까지
listen
주로
to the
이렇게
opinions
보면은
of the parties
북한 핵
involved.
문제는 남북 간에도
So
이론한 적이 있고
we sometimes discuss the declaration between the two Koreas or denuclearization between the two Koreas, but we also have the Geneva Agreement, and we also had talks in Hanoi and Singapore. We also had the six-party talks. So we had various forms of these dialogues. But recently we have seen more dialogue between the US and DPRK. But Korea is definitely a party, but we feel quite marginalized, and this feels somewhat inappropriate. So maybe we can turn to Dr. Cha for a brief comment. So if we discussed denuclearization centered around the US and DPRK, do you think it's effective and appropriate? Just briefly, please.
I'm sorry, when you say effective and appropriate,
적절하고 효과적이라.
But it is
in what
appropriate to have this discussion on North Korea just between Pyongyang and Washington.
So no, I mean, it's clear that North Korea wants to talk just to the United States, but I think from a U.S. alliance perspective, it's much better for the United States to be having these conversations in consultation with the ROK and with Japan and with other interested parties. I think the six-party format worked pretty well, certainly in terms of diplomatic maneuvering and negotiations among the parties to get consensus positions. The U.S., the DPRK would prefer a bilateral negotiation with the United States, but that is not really in the interests of the alliance.
예, 이 문제는 당사자 문제에 대해서는 아마
Well,
비슷한
concerning this issue, I'm sure that we have similar ideas. Maybe we can go to the Yun camp for your remarks.
핵 문제를
Regarding the denuclearization, if we are to just utilize the bilateral channel between North Korea and the US, that's not appropriate. So in our pledges, if North Korea wants or if it is appropriate, we may open a trilateral line of communication at the Panmunjom. This is once again a reminder that Korea is an important stakeholder. I hope that is a practical and realistic plan, but it may not be realistic or easy to implement. So, President candidate Yoon, what do you think? I think we know the position of North Korea,
and so we need to make sure that we increase our role. It could be a three-party talk, a four-party talk, but we need to expand our role in collaboration with the US. And I believe it's great to have a multilateral format, but in operating that multilateral format, we need to make sure that Korea participates in this with a big role. So we will continue to discuss this issue. And I have a last question. So because of COVID-19, North Korea is going through various difficulties, and they're in dire need of humanitarian aid. And so, separate from the denuclearization process, is there a need to provide active humanitarian aid to North Korea? Or do you believe that we need to have strategic management of North Korea to make sure that they do not proceed with their nuclear program with the sanctions in place? So, do we need to completely separate humanitarian aid with denuclearization? Do we need to play an active role for humanitarian aid? What are your thoughts? Maybe we can go to the Yun camp first. Well, I think I'm confusing you. Yes. Yes, I should not be talking about candidate Yoon's position. I should be talking about candidate Lee's position. I think you got confused again. And we will also listen to the opinion of Washington through either Dr. Cha or Dr. Katz.
네.
저는 가능한 한, 저도 마찬가지고 이재명 후보도 마찬가지고 가능한 한
I believe, and candidate Lee believes, that we need to separate political issues from humanitarian aid as much as possible, especially taking into consideration the domestic situation of North Korea, which we all know is quite difficult. We are of one ethnic group, and so we cannot turn a blind eye to the difficulties of North Korea. So we need to provide humanitarian aid. Candidate Lee has been interested in this issue and has had many ideas ever since he was a governor of Gyeonggi Province.
As for humanitarian assistance, presidential candidate Yoon has said on many occasions that even before any progress is made for denuclearization, there is a need to provide humanitarian aid to North Korea. But what we need to be careful about is a distinction between humanitarian aid and strategic aid. So providing rice or other grains, if it is more than 50,000 tons, then it can be considered as strategic aid. So we need to be cautious about the extent of humanitarian aid so that such aid will benefit the ordinary people in North Korea rather than the military and the regime. But currently, even if we say we are willing to supply vaccines to North Korea, they're saying no. So I wonder how much they're willing to accept our goodwill. Thank you.
Dr. Cha
or Dr. Katz, who would like to comment on this issue?
Dr. Katz,
maybe, about humanitarian process aid and denuclearization. These are already separate issues, but do you think we need to be more active in providing humanitarian assistance?
Yes, thank you, Foreign Minister Song. I'm happy to comment on this. I think, yes, absolutely, humanitarian aid is something that the United States, South Korea, others should always be considering, just in terms of general humanity and helping the North Korean people. Verification has always been an issue, as well as North Korea's willingness to accept the aid, so these are complicating factors. In terms of whether it has to be a quid pro quo, I think, Singapore's statement was criticized, I think, fairly in some senses for being quite vague, but it did front load better relations. Denuclearization came third. And so it opened a space to kind of have these issues like the providing of aid. Other things, the end of war declaration is another one of these things, confidence building measures that come in this peace regime kind of bucket. The advantage of humanitarian aid is, of course, it doesn't deal directly, it doesn't affect alliance equity. So you can be building confidence, you can be building better relations, making a better environment, of course, if North Korea wants to accept it, all while not risking the alliance equities that come into the play with the complications with the end of war declaration. So I do think it can be delinked, even through prior statements that have been approved by both sides.
감사합니다. 오늘
Thank you very much. We have been able to invite renowned experts in this area for their precious opinions. I did not intend to do this, but I continue to confuse the advisors to the two presidential candidates. I believe that unconsciously I felt like the opinions of the two camps were quite befitting to each other, and so I possibly looked forward to great policies through collaboration. And thank you very much for your participation all the way across the Pacific. Dr. Cha, Dr. Katz, thank you very much for your insights. So between Seoul and Washington, I could see that there are no clear differences of opinions. And I believe that we can work together for improved policies.
말씀 잘 들었습니다. 세션 2
Thank you
한반도
very
비핵
much.
평화의 길.
This brings us to the end of session 2, the role to Korean Peninsula denuclearization and peace. Thank you very much to our panelists. We will take a 5-minute break and return for our policy proposal.
이것이 JTBC 포텐. 이제 터질 일만 남았지.
지금부터 찾아봐야지.
더 신나게, 더 짜릿하게, 더 행복하게 터질 거예요. 앞으로 만날 더 다채로운 즐거움. 기대해도 좋아요. JTBC 포텐. 즐거움이 터진다. 헤어에는 컬이 있어야 한다.
라디오에는 안테나가 있어야 한다.
나비에게는 날개가 있어야 한다.
연애에는 밀당이 있어야 한다.
음악에는 울림이 있어야 한다.
노래에는 절제가 있어야 한다.
가사에는 진정성이 있어야 한다.
무대는 여유가 있어야 한다.
성공에는
실패가 있어야 한다.
실패에는
다시가 있어야 한다.
다시
다시
나를
나를
부르다.
부르다.
싱어게인 2.
널 처음 만났을 때가 생각나. 내가 만약 평범한 젊은이였다면 내가 종이 비행기를 줍지 않았더라면 애초에 널 만나지 않았더라면
너 내가 누군지 모르지?
녹색과 귤색과 분홍색 다채로운 즐거움 아마 난 너를 좋아하나 봐 기쁨과 슬픔도 고맙고 아름다운 순간들 아마 난 너를 사랑하나 봐
JTBC
네, 지금까지 여야 대선 후보들의 외교
So
안보
we
정책
have
방향과
had
글로벌
sessions
전략에
with
대해
global
다뤄봤습니다.
experts
내년
as
3월
well
출범할
as
차기
the
정부에
chief
필요한
foreign
미래
policy
외교 전략에
advisors of the
대해
two
재단법인
presidential
한반도 평화
camps.
만들기 외교 안보 TF에서 말하는
Now,
정책 제안을 듣는
we're going to
순서를
invite
마련하는데요.
the policy
한반도
proposal
평화 만들기 이사를 맡고
by
계신
Professor
박병림
Park
연세대
Myung-lim,
교수를
professor of
모시고
Yonsei
발표
University
청해듣도록
and
하겠습니다.
director of the Korea Peace Foundation.
네, 여러분 안녕하십니까?
Good morning.
저는 방금
As
소개받은
have been
한반도
introduced,
평화
I am
만들기
Park
외교
Kyung-lim, Director of Korea Peace
먼저
Foundation.
중앙일보 CSIS
First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to invite me. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the JoongAng CSIS Forum 2021 for this invitation. Thank you to Chairman Hong Seok-hyun, as well as President John Henry and the old friends I have at CSIS for this
저희가
opportunity.
오늘 드릴 말씀은
21세기
I would like to take this
오늘의
opportunity to talk
한국이 어떠한
about
글로벌 전략을
Korea's global
추구해야
strategy
하는데 초점이
in the
맞춰져
21st
있습니다.
century.
저희가 생각하기에 한국의
I believe
글로벌 전략은
that Korea's global
역사적으로
strategy
한국이 품어오고
from the
발전시켜온
macro
세
historical
가지의
perspective
핵심 요소로부터
is based
발원된다고
on
판단하고
three
있습니다.
factors.
첫째는
First,
한국이 경제국가,
Korea
가계국가로서의
has
벼랑적이고
always
융합적인
played the role
정체성을
of a
견지해왔다는
bridge
점입니다.
for
두 번째는
convergence.
근대
Second,
이후에
ever since
해양국가,
modern times,
민주주의,
we
시장
were a
경제 체제로서의
marine state,
주체성,
a
근대성,
democratic
문명성을
and
발전시켜왔다는
capital
점입니다.
market country.
세 번째는
And third,
발전 이후로
ever since
다시
our development,
대륙국가로서의
we have
역사성,
gone back
재진출,
to being a
재확장성을
continental state
키워왔다는 점입니다.
to continue to
이 세
expand
가지
ourselves.
한국의 핵심 요소를
And so,
고려할 때
based on these
이제
three factors,
G7, G9 또는 D10 반열에
through-
올라섰다고
we
평가받는
believe that Korea
오늘날
is one
한국의
of the
글로벌
G7 or
전략은
G8 or G10.
첫째,
And so our global strategy is as
전략이라고
follows.
말씀드릴 수 있겠습니다.
First is to lead.
그동안의 추격 전략에
Up until
기반한
now, we were
상품 수출과
always a
무역
country to catch up in terms
넘어서서
of product
이제
and
인류
trade.
보편의 기술과
But now we are
문명,
leading
가치,
universal
문화를
technologies,
세계와
culture, and
공유하는
values of the world.
국제적
And
선진
we have
기술
become
문명 국가로서의
an international
문화,
country
가치 창출에
to
기여하지
lead the
않으면 안
creation of
된다고
culture
판단하고
and
있습니다.
values.
특별히 이미
In
기술
particular,
분야에서는
in
전자,
terms of
자동차,
technology, in
원자력,
automotives,
반도체,
semiconductors,
스마트폰,
electronics,
배터리,
smartphones,
그리고 문화
batteries,
영역에서는
and culture,
최근에 저희가 보다시피
as you are
기생충,
well aware, we have
BTS,
had issues of
오징어
parasites,
게임처럼
Squid
한국의
Game,
기술
and
영토와
other
문화
examples
이미
of
세계를
expanding
덮고
our
있습니다.
cultural frontier
번째는
and technology frontier.
보편주의입니다.
Second is
기존의
universality.
분단, 통일,
We were a
민족을
country that
위주로
was
고려한
divided, that
특수주의적
was looking
전략을
forward
추구하되
to
이제는 이를
reunification.
뛰어넘어
That was the
국익을
uniqueness
기본으로
of
하되
Korea. But now we
동아시아 및
focus
인류
on more
전체의
universal
평화와
values
공존을
of
위한
peace in
국제
Northeast
공익과
Asia,
국제
as well as
공공재
public good
형성과
for the
제공에도
whole
크게
international community.
기여하지 않으면 안 된다는 점입니다. 요건데 이제
For example,
공고한 한반도 평화의 성취는 동아시아 평화와
having a
세계
secure
평화를
Korean
위한
Peninsula
세계 시민적
will
의무요
be our
책무라는 점을
responsibility
깊이
as a part
인식하지
of
않으면 안
Northeast
된다고
Asia.
판단합니다. 세 번째는
Third
통합 접근입니다.
is to
군사,
have convergence in our approach.
동맹과 같은
We need
전통
to
외교 안보 이제와
have
인권,
traditional
통상,
security issues of
기술,
military and
환경,
alliance, but also
보건과 같은
human rights,
신흥
health
외교
issues.
안보의
They are
포괄
new
전략이
security issues, and so we need to
필수적입니다.
converge these two
한국
together.
외교 안보 전략과 영역의 비약적 확장에
In our
바탕하여
security strategies, we need to continue to
사주,
expand the
평화로부터
realm
더
so
나아가
that we can
원자력,
protect our
우주,
peace and sovereignty,
생태,
as
기후,
well as
의료,
contribute to
방역까지
medicine,
전면적으로
disease
포괄하는
control,
통합
space,
접근이
and other
필수입니다.
technologies and domains.
현대 한국의 국제
Modern
위상의
day
궤적을
Korea,
간단히 살펴보고
let's take a look at
오늘날의
our
국제 전략에
international
대해서
position
말씀드리겠습니다.
and then talk about our
한국은
international strategies.
세계 질서 격변 시기에
Korea,
주변 4강의
in this
세력
era
권위 시기마다
of changing
위상과
international order,
전략이 격변을
we
겪었습니다.
have gone through changes in our
일본의
position.
부상과 중화 제재
We have
체제에
had the rise of
전쟁을
Japan,
맞았습니다.
and we went through the
일본의
Sino-Japan
서구
War.
미국의 도전 시기에는
And
아시아 태평양 전쟁을
When the
경험하였습니다.
U.S. came into power,
소련의
we had the Asia-Pacific War,
부상과
and when we
밀소
had the
대결
emergence
시대에는
of
한국 전쟁을
Soviet Union,
경험하였습니다.
we went through the
그
Korean
이후
War.
한미
And ever
동맹의
since then,
체결로 인해서
we went through the
한대륙
signing of the
해양
U.S.
국가 전략을
ROK
채택하고
alliance,
비약적 발전을
and
했습니다.
we went through great development as a
한랭전
marine state.
소련의 해체와 중국의
In the
재부상
post-Cold War
이후에
era and the rise of
미중
China,
대결의
we are
시대를
now
목도하고
meeting
있습니다.
the era of the
그동안은
U.S.-China
한국은
confrontation.
안보와
Up until
경제의
now,
병행 발전 전략을
we have
추구해서
always
한미
worked on
동맹과
security and
한중
economic
협력의
development at the
바탕에서
same time.
지속적으로
So we have worked
발전해온 것이
through our
사실입니다.
partnership with China
그러나
and our
이제는
alliance with the
미중
U.S.
대결의 신호와 함께
But with
점차
the
한계도
U.S.-China
명확해지고 있습니다.
confrontation, the limitations are becoming
따라서
more clear.
미중
And
대결
therefore,
시대에
in this
한반도
era of
문제와
U.S.-China
관련해서
confrontation,
가장 중요한 핵심은
the core
한반도 문제
concerning
해결
Korean
과정에서
Peninsula is
미중
that in
대립이
finding solutions for the
악화가
Korean
결코 아니라
Peninsula,
반대로
we need to make sure
미중 대립이
that the
완화와
U.S.-China
해소를 위한
confrontations
경로와 방향을
becomes a
제시하고
channel for
발전해야 한다는
finding
점입니다.
solutions for the Korean
동아시아에서
Peninsula.
East Asia, we are continuing to mature our democracy and market economy based on the US-ROK alliance, and therefore we are the compass for democracy and market economy in Asia. We need to be able to share our past experience with the neighboring countries, and we are being well recognized for our experiences around the world, and that is the type of perspective that we need to equip ourselves with. Ultimately, we need to work on peace between US and China and play a bridge for peace in East Asia. And when we do so, what is important for Korea is that we have strategic differentiation of agendas. In the US-China confrontation, if there are issues that go beyond the capacity of Korea that is directly related to the national interests of the bilateral relations, then we will have to choose. But when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, we will need to be rooted in the US-ROK alliance, and if it comes to human rights and net zero as well as other universal values, we need to work with universality through the international community and the UN. That is the way for Korea to make sure that we have predictability, universality, and confidence building. That is the direction that we should be moving in. And when we do so, the Korean Peninsula is in the middle of various conflicts, and we believe that by utilizing our military power, our technological power, and our culture, we can overcome this geopolitical situation. The Korean Peninsula, up until now, has been the battleground for US and China. It was the only place in history where there was a collision between China and the US. Other than the Korean War, there was never an example of outright war between the two nations. Currently, the possibility of an outright war between these two countries on the Korean Peninsula is very low, and so we need to make sure that we build our capacity for peace through our technology and our universal values so that we can continue to work on cooperation, alliance, and our agenda making between the two nations. And so we need to shift from a security alliance to a value alliance and a technology alliance, and that will be the future of the US-ROK alliance. Furthermore, we also need to work on multilateralism in East Asia. We should not be fixed on just the inter-Korean issues, but we also have to work on the US, Japan, the ROK Japan, the ROK US, and ROK China relations. And we also need to work with our peace axis towards the north and also towards the south as a core country for peace in this area. And when we do so, we can go beyond bilateral relations concerning China and North Korea. We should not question the history, and we don't question our history, and we question the history with Japan. We need to overcome these controversies, and so we need to base our relations on universality so that history does not keep us from moving forward into the future. In the process of denuclearization, we need to work with the constructive rules of not only China but also Japan. Let me talk about the inter-Korean relations. The basic framework needs to reflect the Korean Peninsula. So not only are we going to talk about the two Koreas, but also Korean Peninsula. We need to make sure that we have peaceful coexistence. And when we do so, then we need to recognize each other as sovereign states, as equal parties in these treaties. And we need to make sure that the basic framework can change our relations into universal values. And when we do so, then we can look forward to propelling denuclearization forward. And the basic framework should be ratified by the two parliaments so that we can work on reunification and denuclearization at the same time, so that we can work with reunification policies even before denuclearization. We need to have that room for maneuver, and we need to connect this ultimately with denuclearization. If we take a look at denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula, maintaining the status quo is no longer an option. If we are not able to deal with denuclearization, North Korea will, in the near future, become a de facto nuclear state. And so we need to come up with at least an interim agreement on this topic. We need to work on lower-level denuclearization as well as the responding compensation so that we can work forward to peace on the Korean Peninsula, normalization of inter-Korean ties, as well as normalization of US-DPRK ties. In that process, we can work on denuclearization, peace, as well as normalization of US-DPRK relations. And so we need to make sure that the peace treaty and denuclearization go hand in hand. We have been able to confirm this through the recent US-DPRK dialogue. We need to make sure that President Biden sends a letter to Kim Jong-un so that he can open dialogue with DPRK. We have had a moratorium for the North Korean nuclear issue for quite a long time now. So we cannot lose out on this opportunity. We also need to work on traditional diplomacy capacity and the non-traditional diplomatic capacities. If we take a look at the non-traditional diplomacy and security issues, it includes life and humanity, technology, standards, knowledge, climate, disease control, and medicine. If we take a look at climate and environment as well as public health, Korea has worked on our security strategies, and so we can provide ODA in this field through our diplomacy, and we can also work on strategies such as hosting future COP meetings. We also need to work with the Asia-Pacific nations through a network to prevent communicable diseases so that we can set forward a model for public health in this region. Last but not least, the foundation of all of these strategies is the solidarity within South Korea. We need to go beyond the two political parties, and we need to make sure that there's a continuation of our government so that we can win the confidence of countries around the world and make sure that our foreign policies become continuous. And that is why we need to have harmony between the political parties in Korea as well as their supporters. Especially in the non-traditional diplomacy, experts are becoming more and more important. And so we need to make sure that we go beyond political affiliations so that we emphasize the expertise in the diplomatic domain. I would like to now conclude with the following. We have various heroes in Korea, including Lee Sun-shin, and we also have Paul Beck, which is a Nobel laureate, as well as Willard Price, who is a well-known geographer in the U.S. All of these people have agreed that for hundreds of years, Korea has maintained peace, but with the volatility of the neighboring powers, we have gone through various wars, including the Korean War, and we have become a part of massive wars. But other than these times, we have always maintained precious peace. Wiley has mentioned that in 1943, we have already become a blood alliance. So we have enjoyed peace for decades, and then all of a sudden, if there are conflicts between neighboring powers, we would get involved and absorbed into conflict. And so we need to make sure that we keep this history in mind. The US ROK alliance has led us to mature, and now we have become a part of G7, G8, or G10. And so we need to make sure that we establish permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula so that we can become a part of peace in East Asia and around the world. And we look forward to Korea's contribution through our wisdom and strategies. Thank you very much. I am Park Myung-lim, Director of Korea Peace Foundation, and I spoke on behalf of the foundation. Thank you very much.
네, 말씀 고맙습니다.
Thank you
이번
very much,
정책 제안이 새
Professor
정부의
Park.
외교 안보 정책
I
수립에
hope
많은
that this
도움이
policy
되기를
proposal will be
기대하겠습니다.
informative and
이것으로
helpful
중앙일보
for the
CSIS
presidential
Forum
campaigns.
2021을
With
모두
this,
마치도록
we'd like to
하겠습니다.
conclude the
내년에는
JoongAng
다시
CSIS
오프라인에서
Forum
여러분과 얼굴
2021, and I hope to be able to see you in person next year at this forum.
오늘 29일 오전 10시 JTBC에서
And
특집 방송으로
this
만나보실 수
forum will
있습니다.
be
시청해주신
broadcast
여러분,
once again on
고맙습니다.
JTBC at 10 p.m. on the 29th. Thank you.